Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell. "Mommy, I'm cold," said 5-year-old Kelly said calmly, mundanely. Not complaining, just giving information. She was the one who cried at first, but then somehow even accepted their new life. Not for nothing they say that children quickly adapt to everything new. Perhaps Nancy Mom Girl was even harder to get used to the fact that over the past year, hunger and cold have become integral parts of their lives. "Be patient for a while. Daughter," affectionately, she said, trying to hide the traitorous shiver in her voice. "They'll bring the stove to be heated. Porridge for their own. Everything will be all right. My darling." "I know," Mom replied Kelly confidently. "Let me help you with the firewood." No, I got it," Nancy hastily replied. She stepped out of the decrepit shed and tried to make sure her daughter didn't see the tears on her face. It wasn't hard to do. The only light they had was provided by an old oil lamp. Of course, it was simply not capable of properly illuminating all the rooms, and often Nancy thought it was for the best. The shed was cramped with one single window under the low ceiling, where instead of the long drunken glass they put simple polyethylene film. True, in several layers. For better heat preservation, the sunlight penetrating inside became dull and dreary, perfectly harmonized with the shabby furnishings of the room. The only furniture here was 2 narrow beds, a small closet, an old stove, which served the mother and daughter as a stove for cooking and heaters. The only consolation was that the barn was solid oak logs, so it was in no danger of collapse or a hole in the floor or ceiling. In fact, it had been used as a temporary home for the family a long time ago, before they built a new big and spacious house, because it was not easy to live here, but it was possible. Nancy herself, come to think of it, had grown up in more difficult circumstances, though that fact was hardly a comfort to her. At first, though, she had been about the age that little Kelly was now. Everything in her life was fine. She herself, of course, did not remember those times very well, and relied more on her mother's stories. She often recalled what a wonderful man, husband, and father Nancy's late father had been, working and then not helping and babysitting when he had time. And of course, he loved Mom very much, just as she loved him. And they lived, as they call it, soul to soul without any quarrels and scandals. They raised their daughter, saved money for a larger apartment, planning that soon little Nancy would have a brother too. The only thing that marred this relationship turned out to be Nancy's mom-dad. Her mother didn't like her mother-in-law from the very moment the young people met each other, and she didn't even think about hiding this fact or trying to get in touch with her daughter-in-law and get to know her better. She was the kind of woman for whom their children, especially their sons, make up their whole world, are the meaning and center of all their dull and gray life. Such see their offspring's partners not as their personal happiness, but as their misfortune, and see them as rivals for their precious child's attention. That is why Nancy and the mother had no chance to get along with her mother-in-law, though she tried her best to do so. She tried everything. She came to visit with flowers and candy and tried to find common interests. Even had nothing against the fact that her husband all weekend spent not with her, but with his parents. Everything was in vain. Any contact between them ended in an ugly scandal arranged by her mother-in-law. Nancy's father, caught between the 2 women he loved, was also unable to find ways to reconcile them, despite his best efforts, so he shuttled between them, trying to give each of them enough attention without offending the other. Maybe it's the constant tension. That's what ultimately caused him to pass away too soon. Yes, in addition, for the reason that rarely takes young people away, he was not yet 30 years old when a heart attack brought him to the grave. Nancy's mom, of course, grieved terribly, but had no idea that major trials were yet to come for her. A few days after the secret father was buried on the doorstep of their apartment, the mother-in-law showed up. Mom at first even rejoiced at this visit. She decided that there is a blessing in disguise. Maybe now, having lost her son, the woman will show at least some interest in the only reminder of him that remained in this world, his daughter, and consequently, her own granddaughter, whose existence she had not even noticed until then. Of course, after all that there could be no more warm relations between the two women, but perhaps they would have turned from openly hostile to neutral and calm. But that wasn't the case. The mother-in-law had other plans, and she didn't come to reconcile with her daughter-in-law and share her grief. "What's up, bitch?" She started right from the doorstep. "You've gotten your way and you've driven my son into the grave." "Miranda, what are you talking about?" That Molly, the mother, was confused. "What I am saying is the truth I am saying. I always knew this was how it would end. From the moment I saw you, I knew it right away. This girl will ruin my Leshchenko. He must run away from her." But he did not listen to me. So he paid for it. "Miranda, I understand your grief, but you're unfair to me." "Oh, unfair," the mother-in-law exclaimed. "I'll show you justice. Such a viper." She literally threw in her daughter-in-law's face some very weighty folder. And while the thin mother opened it and tried to figure out what it all meant, she continued her monologue. "Take this." She nodded contemptuously at the little Nancy with frightened eyes, looking out of the cradle at the whole scene. "And get out of my apartment so you won't be here before tonight." "What do you mean out of your apartment?" More surprised. What did Nancy resent? "Mom, we bought it when we were married. It is a jointly acquired property, which now belongs to me and our daughter, your, by the way, granddaughter. And you look at the documents," said the mother-in-law. "And what? Just so they gave you the apartment?" Leshchenko wrote on me. At least on this, he had enough brains. And that, you see, jointly acquired while my poor son humping at work at 12 o'clock a day. "You've been living off the books here, haven't you?" Of course, the daughter-in-law could answer that she worked before Nancy was born. She even went on maternity leave just before she gave birth, and before that she worked as hard as her husband. But she wouldn't do it. In the first place, because it was useless to argue with her mother-in-law. She would not listen to any arguments anyway. And secondly, the woman simply did not have the strength to say anything. The fact is that she still looked into the folder and made sure that her mother-in-law said the truth. The apartment, according to the documents, belonged to her. And this could only mean one thing. From that moment on, both she and her young daughter were homeless. What followed was several years of unrelenting hell. They moved around in some communal apartments, often changing them as the rent went up. The mother's small salary was barely enough to support them, and there was no one to help them. After all, the woman was an orphan. Her strength was only enough to somehow drag her only daughter to adulthood, for which she was very grateful. And even the day Nancy turned 18, her mother went to meet her father. Her heart, too, could not bear all the strain and turmoil that had been heaped on her fragile shoulders. So she was left alone. Now she had to earn her own living, the good of all that was needed. Her mother had time to teach her, and in addition, showed her a perfect example of how carefully one should treat the choice of a life partner. And the very young girl promised herself that she would never repeat her mother's mistakes and would not allow her children to live in such conditions as she herself had to live in. Because of constant moving, Nancy often had to change schools. Often it turned out so that she only had time to get used to the new place, but had to break off again and go to another neighborhood, or even the city. Of course, under such conditions, she studied not too well, and the question of entering the university in front of her did not even stand, and the early death of her mother made it impossible for her to get a higher education. To feed herself, the girl had to get a job right after graduation. She was lucky. Probably the first time in her conscious life, she managed to get a position as a sales consultant in a very expensive clothing store. Of course, the work was hard and quite boring, like any unskilled labor. However, it was still a better option than getting a job as a cleaner or dishwasher. And the salary she was offered was quite decent. With that money, she could even rent herself a decent room. One of its main advantages was that it could be locked from the inside. Nancy's life was very monotonous. Work, home, work again, and so on. The girl didn't have too many weekends, and it could be called her personal choice. She herself took a large number of extra shifts to get more money. In those days, she earned as much as her mother had never dreamed of. However, like many children from poor families who had a very difficult childhood, she had fallen into one of two extremes between denying herself everything and fanatically hoarding money for emergencies and mindlessly spending it. Nancy chose the second option. The thought of not buying something she didn't really need but could afford was almost physically painful. Fortunately, she did not get into any loans and debts and lived quite well within the means that she had. Nevertheless, Nancy spent all her salary without a trace, often on things that were not necessary at all, on pretty brooches, bracelets, trips to cafes, movie tickets, and other pleasant trifles. Often she told herself that it would be good to start saving. Even once she thought that if she limited herself to only the really necessary things, she could have already saved, for example, for the first installment on the mortgage, or just create a very substantial safety cushion. In her mind, however, realizing how important all of this was, Nancy could not bring herself to start saving. Emotions whispered to her that she was doing just fine now. There didn't seem to be any emergencies. She was doing well, so she could not be afraid of dismissal, as well as, for example, the ruin of a very popular chain of stores, one of which she worked in. And every time she listened to her emotions, which were stronger than the voice of reason, of course, then scolded herself for it, but could not fix anything, and only promised herself that from the next paycheck she would definitely begin to behave more reasonably. Which, of course, never happened. That's how she lived until she met Charles. He came into her store, completely unplanned, in the mall where Nancy worked. He was supposed to have some very important work meeting, but on the way out, his pants were rolled up with mud by a passing car driver. Here was a man looking for more to his good fortune. Charles arrived at the meeting well in advance. It turned out that he didn't have a typical clothing size, and Nancy spent almost 40 minutes trying to find some pants that would fit the man more or less decently. Finally, she succeeded. He was satisfied with the quality of service and promised to come back for more shopping sometime. Something to brighten up the long search. Nancy and Charles were having a very lively conversation, and if at first it was just about the weather outside the window, then they talked about other topics, including the fact that they liked the same music and the same movies, and found some more common ground. He came in again 2 weeks later with a coffee stain on his jacket. In a strange coincidence, it was Nancy who served him again. When she saw that the customer had the same problem again, she couldn't help but laugh. To her surprise, Charles was not offended at all. On the contrary, appreciating the ridiculousness of the situation, he joined her. "And you excuse me," Nancy said at last. "It's just that it's really kind of funny." "You don't say." He echoed a second time in the same place. "And you're here again. Either your mall has some kind of enchantment or the universe is subtly telling me that it's better not to deal with these partners. Don't think this happens to me all the time. Honestly, 2 weeks ago was the first time in my entire life. Or maybe it's our store that's bewitched." Nancy smiled. "Attracted to you. It makes a certain amount of sense," Charles replied. "But it's probably not the store itself that attracts me, but one of its charming employees. To tell you the truth, I've been thinking about you all these days." "Oh, that's very nice," Nancy said. "And I think I'll answer frankly to frankness. I've been thinking of you too. I think we had a very successful conversation last time," Charles confirmed enthusiastically. "Well, if that's so, let me ask you when your next day off is expected." Nancy had never been so happy about the end of the month. They had extra shifts at the beginning of each month. That's because she hadn't had time to pick up any extra work yet. And the next day off she had to come in just a couple of days, and she informed her new acquaintance about it. Their romance developed rapidly. Both of them never believed in such nonsense as love at first sight, and both of them found it. Already in a month they were practically inseparable, spending all their free time together. Nancy, to the surprise of her superiors, even stopped taking extra shifts. Of course, Formally, it was not a prerequisite for work, but everyone had already gotten used to the fact that the girl always helps out her colleagues. In addition, it was accepted in the store, albeit unspoken, that a certain number of extra hours were taken by all employees without exception. And now, when Nancy decided to work only those shifts, which were assigned to her under the contract, in the team began serious conflicts. The girl still performed her work well, not giving the bosses the slightest reason for her dismissal. However, no one could prevent them from depriving her of her bonus, which was a large part of her salary. And her coworkers started to shit on the smallest things, literally making her stay in the store completely unbearable. Nancy, in spite of everything, did not even think of giving up. She continued to simply perform her duties, despite all the difficulties and obstacles. However, with her new salary, she was no longer able to afford not only entertainment, but even to rent a room. From Charles, Nancy hid her problems to the last. But of course, he could not help noticing the changes taking place with his favorite woman. "Nancy," he said one day, "I'm sorry, of course. Perhaps I'm minding my own business. But there's something that's been bothering you a lot lately. Is there anything I can do to help you? Or at least just listen? Sometimes it can be really helpful to talk things out." "Just a little trouble at work." She waved it off. "Nothing particularly serious." "Right?" Charles asked, looking at her intently. "Right." Nancy tried to answer firmly and confidently, but her voice shook involuntarily. Charles continued to stare at her without saying a word. He realized that the matter was much more serious than she was trying to make it seem. But he also realized that if he questioned her, Nancy would simply shut herself up and certainly not say a word to him. So he waited patiently for the girl to gather her strength and tell him about her problem. And so she did. After a few minutes of tense silence, Nancy, tired of pretending, burst into tears at the table of the cafe where they were sitting. Charles embraced her and started stroking her back and head, letting her know that he was near and ready to support her in any situation. Finally, she calmed down enough to speak, even though her words were jumbled. Pity with them, sobs behind them. "You see, it's actually because of you. I mean, I'm not saying it's your fault. In fact, you had nothing to do with it at all. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. Nancy, just tell me everything from the beginning." "From the beginning, yes," she echoed. "You see, when you and I started dating, I stopped taking extra shifts at the store. It's not technically illegal, but I understand," Charles echoed. "But they can't fire you for that, can they?" "Of course they can't fire me, but they can take a pay cut. I don't know how to live on the money I get now, not enough to buy food or rent a room. I'm afraid that I'll soon get into debt or something like that. I have absolutely no idea what to do in this situation." "What do you mean, what?" Charles was surprised. "Quit. If the conditions are so unbearable, is there any point in putting up with them?" Nancy tried to object, but the man didn't let her say a word. "I understand what you're saying. That's exactly what they want. If you fire them, they all kind of benefit. So be it. Do you want to work in a group like that?" "Oh, no." Sadly, Nancy sighed. "And I hadn't even thought about it. But if now I have enough money for food or shelter, when I quit, I won't have enough for anything. And it's not like I'll be able to find a new job anytime soon." "Well, first of all, I'm sure you can. As far as I can tell, you're a pretty good salesman. There's a lot of talent out there. I think your employer's competitors are gonna have a field day with you. And secondly, why would you want to live in a room with strangers? Come to my place. I think this step in our relationship has been a long time coming. I've been hesitant to invite you, and my income is enough for the two of us." Charles, "Well, it's a little awkward, Nancy. I don't want to sit on someone's neck, especially not on the man I love. I'm not dating you for your money or your business. Don't worry, honey, I'm well aware of that. Otherwise, I wouldn't be making you this offer. It wouldn't be a pleasure to have you in my apartment." Still, Nancy was not ready to accept this generous offer so immediately. For another 2 weeks, she walked around pondering whether she should move in and quit her job. The rapidity with which their relationship was developing was somewhat frightening to the girl, but in the end, she made her decision and agreed. After all, Charles was certainly right about one thing. She would be able to find a new job anyway. And if things went wrong in their life together, she could rent another room and move out. So why not give it a try? It often happens that when people start living together, they quickly find out that they are actually incompatible. There are domestic conflicts, or even it turns out that it's not very easy to bear each other in a small piece of space every day. In the case of Nancy and Charles, it was nothing like that. On the contrary, when the two moved in together, it was as if they had become even closer and closer to each other. The wedding was fast approaching. There was only one thing that confused the girl. Finding a new job was not as easy as they had thought it would be. Nancy was really a good saleswoman and had learned a lot while working in her store. She had everything one could wish for: experience, knowledge, skills, and an innate quality suited to this line of work. Nevertheless, no one wanted to hire her. The girl even began to suspect that this is a kind of greeting from previous employers who gave her a disgusting characteristic. However, most likely, it was something else. She was even too good for her job and had the appropriate salary expectations, and no one was willing to pay her the money she was asking for. It was easier to hire less talented girls who were able to do some work, but who wanted less money. But of course, no one talked about it openly. Otherwise, Nancy might have reduced her appetite. But alas, she had no idea that this was what had to be done. "Come on, Nancy," Charles urged her. "I told you 1,000 times what I earn. It's enough for the two of us, even the three of us. I mean, when we decide to have a baby. And if something happens to you, would you mind?" Nancy, oh, what could happen to me? Get hit by a streetcar, or a brick fall on my head. So something like that can happen at any time, including before you even get a job. You can't be safe, honey, but it's worth a try. Well, see, you've been trying for a month now, and it's no use. Well, at least for the relay race. You deserve a vacation. Let's get married. We'll go on a vacation, and then you can go on with your search, if it's so important to you. In the end, Nancy agreed with her fiancé and went into wedding planning. She wanted the celebration to be perfect, so she tried to think about every little detail. Then it was time to meet Charles' mother and her future mother-in-law. Frankly speaking, this moment with Nancy was postponed to the last. But now, on the eve of the wedding, it was quite impossible to avoid it. Unless, of course, we take into account the absurd variant, when they will get acquainted directly at the solemn event. The fact is that Nancy was terribly afraid of meeting her future mother-in-law. I remember the terrible experience of my own mother and paternal grandmother. She understood perfectly well that if the relationship does not work out, will come to an end, and her romance with Charles, no matter how much she loved him, it will be impossible to live constantly expecting a blow in the back from his mother. She will certainly be expecting it, even if those fears prove unfounded in the end. This, in turn, may well spoil the relationship and with her husband, and even lead to a painful breakup. So it would be better to break this connection. At once, it will be less traumatic for everyone involved in the events. Of course, Nancy did not share these concerns with her fiancé. He might have taken them to mean that she herself was prejudiced against his mother, though it was not so at all. On the contrary, she sincerely hoped that she would be a nice, kind woman, and that they would be able to find a common language. Charles, who was very sensitive to his bride's moods, did not ask her about anything this time. Of course, he could see her excitement, but he wrote it off as the usual wedding condition peculiar to many women. He even considered himself lucky. The future spouse, not crying all day long, is engaged in some quite constructive activity. Good for him. Besides, in these hectic weeks, Charles was working much harder than usual. He had to get the money for the wedding trip he had already promised Nancy, and he had a great deal of business to attend to so that nothing would fall apart in his absence. After all, being the owner of his own firm, That's a big responsibility. And so the day finally came when Nancy was to meet Charles's mother. From the very morning, she made a fuss, cleaned the apartment, which already shone with crystal cleanliness, cooked, even did the laundry and then dried it with a hairdryer. You can't show a guest and hang her son's underwear out to dry. Nancy, honey, don't be nervous. You said so, and Charles. I'm sure Mom will like you without all this preparation. And if she doesn't, trust me. I've known this woman for years, Charles said with a laugh. Besides, if she doesn't like you, she won't like you. And what will it change? The main thing is that I love you. And my mother doesn't have to. Nancy bit his lip painfully, but kept silent. It didn't matter to him. And from her point of view, if not everything was at stake, then a lot was at stake. It was this meeting that would determine whether their wedding would even happen and whether the relationship would continue. But of course, it was not worth it to frighten Charles with these thoughts beforehand. It was enough that she herself was on pins and needles. At exactly the appointed hour, the doorbell rang, and Nancy hurried to open it. On the threshold stood a woman, quite friendly-looking, holding a cake exactly like the one the hostess herself had bought for the table. She had no time to realize whether it was a bad sign or a good one. The girl on the machine politely said hello to the Bones and invited her to come in. As it turned out, a little later, the same confectionery turned out to be a good omen after all. Molly, the mother-in-law's name, laughed when she saw the same cake on the table, and then happily concluded that since they had similar tastes in sweets, they would somehow manage to agree on everything else. She was a cheerful and pleasant woman. By the end of the dinner, Nancy was chatting with her as if she were an old friend whom she had known since childhood. The bride's mood was rapidly improving. Nothing was going to stop her from marrying Charles, and it was definitely the best news of her life. They had a very modest wedding, not even because they were against noisy and left-field celebrations. It just so happened that there was no one in particular to invite to it. Nancy's parents were long gone. She had no time to make friends. Charles, head over heels in his business, didn't have too many friends either. His father, as it turned out, had died a few years ago, passing the family business on to his son. "What happened to your dad?" Nancy asked me one day. Charles instantly became as serious and focused as the girl had never seen him before. But it was not even this that struck her, but the fact that his face showed not only sorrow, but extreme thoughtfulness, as if his father's death were not a personal tragedy for him, but a mystery he could not solve. You see, it was a strange story. They said he had a heart attack. He was only a little over 40. My dad wasn't even 30 when he died of a heart attack, noted Nancy, who didn't find that fact particularly surprising. Yeah, but mine was perfectly healthy. And I'm sorry, but you told me yourself he had a busy life. Stress and all that. And I doubt he was as obsessed with his health as my constant running around to doctors, mandatory annual checkups, that sort of thing. And he made me and my mother get checked. And there was no sign that he had any heart problems. And then all of a sudden he had a heart attack. It's really weird. But you don't think somebody killed him, do you? Poisoned him or something? Honestly, that's what I think. But why? I mean, you ended up with the business. And as far as I'm concerned, it's been yours for years and you're fine. Could there be any other reason? You're right, of course. Maybe I was just overreacting. I did go to the police, but they didn't find anything suspicious. Seeing how hard it was for Charles to think about the story, Nancy never spoke of his father again. After all, even if he did die of causes other than natural causes, it was unlikely they would ever know the truth, although she personally thought it more likely that the man had actually had a heart attack. All sorts of things happen, including to perfectly healthy people. After the wedding, Nancy and Charles went on a fascinating trip to Europe. The girl, who had never been abroad for a month, came back from there filled with impressions. She felt absolutely happy. She had never experienced such emotions in her entire life. Now, however, they were back in their hometown, and life flowed as it should. Nancy resumed her search for work, which remained as unsuccessful as ever. True, it didn't upset her so much now. She was sure that her husband would help her through any difficulties, and indeed she felt like she was behind a stone wall. A few weeks had passed since their return from their wedding trip. When Nancy found out that she was pregnant, she hurried to share this joyful discovery with Charles. But his reaction was not what the woman had expected. She had hoped that he would share this happy moment with her. But instead, he almost started tearing his hair out. "Charles, honey, aren't you happy we're having a baby? You wanted one too, didn't you?" "Didn't you?" Charles sighed. "I still do. I really do. I don't mean that. It's just that it's a terrible bad time." "What do you mean?" Nancy was worried. He looked long and earnestly at his wife, as if assessing what was worth saying, what was better left unsaid, or maybe he was just gathering his strength. The woman could clearly see how hard it was for him. And besides, she remembered some other facts that she had not paid attention to before. For example, that after Charles returned from Europe, he worked even harder than he had just before the wedding, and certainly more than before. At the very beginning of their acquaintance, and it was supposed to be the other way around. He had settled a great many things before he left, and now he should have been freer. Was it a mistress? A traitorous thought flashed through her mind. Nancy immediately brushed it aside, and was even ashamed that she could have thought such a thing. But what mistress indeed? When would he have had time to get to know her? If they had been together all the time lately. Unless it was before they were married. But then what was the point of getting married? No, it's obviously something else. I mean, Charles finally said, "My business is falling apart. And all I've been doing since we got back is trying to stop this avalanche with my bare hands. I'm sorry. I didn't want to bother you, so I didn't tell you. But now that you are, well, I'm obligated to notify you so you can decide what to do about the pregnancy." "What do you mean by that? What can I do with it?" "Well, maybe it's not the right time for a baby. I'm guessing you don't have much time left." "So no," Nancy interrupted sharply, realizing what he was getting at. "No, darling, whatever it is, I don't intend to get rid of our child. We're going to raise him well anyway." Charles agreed obediently. "But keep in mind that I may soon be left with literally nothing. And now, I'm not even sure I can get a decent job fast enough. But how could I?" Nancy shook her hands. "Everything was fine when we left, wasn't it? Or did you just not want to upset me then?" No, you've got it right, haven't you? Things were really good and great back then. I don't know how that could have happened. And in just a month, it's a total nightmare. I won't bore you with the details, but there's been some weird tax fraud. And a bunch of other irregularities. I can assure you, I didn't know anything about it. And now I'm trying to find out who did it, and if there's anything I can do about it. Yeah, Nancy sighed. I should probably do something to catalyze my job search. Don't get me wrong, I trust you. But from what you're saying, I don't take offense. Honey, you're absolutely right. You may have to be the one to provide for our family for a while. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. No, you're not. It's what I envisioned. I understand, honey, but we're a family, and we have to work through things together. You remember for better or for worse. Of course I remember. Charles smiled. But no matter how hard the man tried, he couldn't do it. According to his own apt expression with his bare hands, to stop a snow avalanche, the prosperous business that his family had built for generations collapsed almost in an instant. But even that wasn't the worst of it. Charles never managed to find out who exactly inside the firm was involved in various money frauds. And all the formal strings, of course, led back to him as the business owner. So he was threatened with a considerable prison term under the criminal article. And to avoid this, it was necessary to pay off the numerous debts in which his company was mired. Charles had no choice but to sell the apartment. Nancy told him without a moment's hesitation that since there were no other options, it had to be done as soon as possible. But where would we live? In despair, exclaimed her husband. Where to live? You and I will figure it out," she answered decisively. "But what will I do if you go to prison for the rest of your life?" "I can't even imagine." Here to the rescue of the young family came Molly, who offered her son and daughter-in-law to move to her in the village. "My house is a big place. There's enough for everyone," she said. "So let's not have any of your objections. You'll be my helpers again. It's a big farm, and I'm not young. I could use an extra hand. And when you get back on your feet, you'll move back to town. If you want to, of course." The young people had no choice but to agree to the proposal. By then, Nancy was long past the point of no work. She hadn't been able to find anything until her belly became too obvious. After that, of course, it would have been foolish to try. No employer would want a pregnant woman, and even late in the pregnancy, on their staff. As for Charles, he came to his senses pretty quickly. He had no time to write. His wife depended on him, their future. The child that was about to be born. A month after the disaster, he found himself a job. Of course, not at the same level as before, as a manager in some small firm. Hopefully, a little more sweat later, looking for something better. I had to go to work, of course, from Molly's village to the city. It wasn't a long way. But that fact couldn't stop Charles. After all, a vegetable garden is a vegetable garden. But you can't eat vegetables alone. And he was simply ashamed to sit on his mother's neck, though she would hardly have minded if he had spent some more time looking for something. Nancy, not wanting to sit idle, actively helped her mother-in-law in the household. Of course, the tasks she was given were not the most difficult, the kind that could not harm her or the future child. She also regularly traveled to the city, despite the long road, which every day became harder to bear. But the woman rightly reasoned that to refuse to see a doctor regularly, even under these conditions, would do more harm than good. Then little Kelly was born. To Nancy's surprise, Molly was in no hurry to take any part in her granddaughter's life. Of course, the woman didn't expect any help from her mother-in-law. After all, she had helped them out enough as it was, so she had every right to rest. After all, she had already canceled her diapers when she was fiddling with little Bones. Nancy was amazed. What Molly was showing to Kelly was complete indifference. Didn't want to play with her, or even just look at the little girl. Of course, she didn't mention it. Not to her mother-in-law, not to her husband. Things happen. Maybe the poor woman was so tired of their presence that she no longer wanted anything. But time went on, and they continued to live in Molly's village house, and neither Charles nor Nancy could find work. For the first 3 years, though, she didn't have time to do it. And time was not playing on her side. Now, in addition to a dubious departure from her previous job, she has a gaping hole in her employment record of almost 5 years. And a small child in her arms did not add to her employer's favor. Charles, on the other hand, remained a simple manager. He could not get a more prestigious position. After all, he was the owner of the company, which had prospered for many years, and under him scandalously ceased to exist. Of course, inside the company where he got a job, his talents were appreciated, but there were simply no opportunities for him to be promoted. "Yeah, don't worry," Molly told them. "Stay with me as long as you need, for the rest of your life. I know it's a difficult situation, and they're not strangers. They're human beings, and they lived. What else could they do? And, in general, they lived quite well in the fresh air, in a good house with fresh vegetables, grown with their own hands. They had enough money for everything they needed. And the landlady seemed to be only happy to have them in her possession. The only thing that every year more and more worried Nancy was rapidly approaching the time when Kelly would have to go to school. Of course, it was good for a child to live in the fresh air, so to speak, in harmony with nature. But to get up at 5 o'clock and go to the city for a lesson is not very convenient. In the village, there were simply no educational institutions. However, no matter how it was, there was still enough time to think of a way out of this situation. In the meantime, you could live in peace and enjoy your happiness. After all, by and large, everything was fine. She and Charles, As promised to each other on the wedding day, together overcame a difficult period, and now together entered a joyful and carefree. The trouble came completely out of the blue. They were celebrating Kelly's 4th birthday. As always, just the three of them. Molly, as it always happens, refused to attend the party, referring to some urgent matters. The couple had long ago stopped paying attention to this quirk of hers. She wasn't very young after all, and she was entitled to her little oddities. Right at the party table, Charles began to feel sick. First, he began to breathe heavily, and just a few minutes later, he fell to the floor, grabbing life by the chest. Frightened, Nancy immediately called an ambulance, and the long minutes of waiting dragged on. It was not until 200 hours later that paramedics were able to reach their backwoods home. They looked at Charles and were talking excitedly amongst themselves. They began loading him onto a stretcher. No one paid much attention to Nancy, as if she wasn't even here. The ambulance workers showed some reaction only when she took her daughter in her arms and started to climb into their car. "So, lady, where are you going?" One of them asked sternly. "I'm the wife of your patient, and I'm going to the hospital with my husband." "Oh, okay. But why bring the child with you? What's a little girl gonna do in the ICU? Watch her daddy die." "What do you mean, dying?" "Literally, he's having a heart attack. And it's been too long since the attack. We're gonna do everything we can. But I'm not gonna get your hopes up. He probably won't even make it to the hospital." Nancy froze and didn't realize that the ambulance had already left. The doctor's words just drowned her out. She felt as if she had been hit on the head with a very heavy object. How is it a heart attack? How is that dying? What the hell is this? Aren't there too many deaths around her for that very reason? And how will she live without her Charles? Molly, to her surprise, reacted quite calmly to her son's condition, and even to the words of the doctor, who could hear as well as Nancy. As soon as the car left, she calmly went on with her vegetable garden chores. As if nothing had happened, she just said something in passing. "What can you do? It's hereditary. His father also died early and, alas, of the same disease. You probably know that yourself. But he's your son." Nancy couldn't stand it. "How can you be so calm? Do I have to lie down and die too?" shouted the mother-in-law. "Is there anything I can do about it?" "I don't think so. So why worry for nothing?" Nancy, startled by her words, went back into the house. She didn't know what to do. To go into town. But she hadn't even been told which hospital Charles was being taken to. Not that there were very many in their little town, but to run to all of them, and with a baby. I mean, even now, it's unlikely her grandmother would even agree to look after Kelly. It's not the smartest thing to do. But she couldn't just sit around waiting for something to happen. In the end, all she could do was pace the room, feverishly thinking about what to do, how to help Charles, and how she would live if she couldn't help him. She was unceremoniously interrupted by a phone call, which was probably the 100th time she had thought about it, but had not yielded any results. With trembling hands, Nancy picked up the phone, and before answering it for a while, just stared at it. She had already guessed what she was about to hear, and it was as if she were trying to delay the inevitable. But of course she couldn't delay it for too long. "Hello? Hello? Nancy." "Yes," she answered in a shaky voice. "It's me." "Nancy, you have a call from the 3rd City Hospital. Is it about your husband? I'm authorized to inform you that the doctors did everything possible to resuscitate him. Unfortunately, despite our best efforts, your husband passed away. I'm sorry for your loss." Nancy had absolutely no recollection of her time. The next hour, I think she sobbed, rolled around on the floor, and almost banged her head against the walls. And it seemed that her own life had ended along with Charles's, that there was no point in her continuing to be in this world. And there's no telling how long it would have lasted or how it would have ended if it hadn't been for Kelly. Scared, the little girl had absolutely no idea what was going on. They were sitting around, celebrating her birthday, and everything was just fine. And then in an instant, everything fell apart. First, something happened to her dad, and now her mom went crazy. For a long time, she hoped all this madness would just go away. But Mommy kept rolling around on the floor and crying bitterly, and little Kelly had no choice but to join her. The sounds her daughter began to make brought Nancy to her senses rather quickly. She sat down on the floor, not exactly calmly, but at least already quite aware of what she was doing, and pressed Kelly against her, albeit briefly, but still she had forgotten even about her, and now she felt guilty. No, this was her raison d'etre. She may no longer have a husband, but she still had a child she was responsible for. Aha, you've calmed down at last, Molly grumbled. Molly quietly appeared in the room and said to Nancy, I must tell you, Lord, how did Charles die? The woman replied indifferently, Yes, I'm following in your footsteps. I told you I wasn't going to waste my energy worrying about it. Nancy made no reply. She could not understand how one could be so calm about the unexpected death of one's own child. Could it be some kind of defense mechanism? Maybe the mother-in-law had not yet fully realized what had happened. Everyone reacts differently to such shocks. She can't really feel nothing. Oh, by the way, Molly, meanwhile, now that you're awake, let's start packing. What do you mean? I don't get it, Nancy. What do you mean? What? You don't think I'd let a stranger stay in my house, do you? You were my son's wife. I'm nobody, and I don't see any reason to keep you here any longer. This shocked Nancy even more. It was exactly the sort of thing she'd been trying to avoid for the rest of her life, and it was exactly what she had finally arrived at. And all of a sudden it occurred to her that it must be a birth curse or something. Otherwise, how else to explain that now she had to repeat her mother's fate? But let's say I'm a stranger to you. Though all the years we've known each other, I've been sure of the opposite, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. But Kelly is Kelly. After all, she is your granddaughter, the daughter of your only son, who is no longer alive. And I'd already told you that I don't like children, and I'm not going to take care of them. I don't want your Kelly here. But where are we going? You know very well I have no home, no job, no relatives. Well, my dear, you should have thought of that before. Why should it suddenly become my problem? Nancy didn't know what to say to that. She had already realized that appealing to this woman's candid feelings was an absolutely useless venture. All this time, she had been hiding her true nature behind a mask of benevolence and friendliness. But now the need to pretend was completely gone. She looked at both the woman who had just lost her husband and her daughter, who was her own granddaughter, with a completely blank stare. Well, all right. Molly suddenly softened. We have an old barn on our property. We lived in it when there was no house. It's cramped, of course, but there's a bed and a stove. It's just enough to get by. You can occupy it for now, but don't let me see you in the house. In fact, don't try to see me too often. Thank you, said Nancy. It wasn't much of an option, of course, but it was better than going out on the street with her daughter. Thanks. You won't get fed up, Molly said, considering this shed you're renting from me. Yeah. Don't interrupt. I know you don't have any money. You'll do all the work in the summer, chop wood in the winter. You'll do all the little errands. For that, you can live in the barn and take a small share of the harvest. All right, Nancy agreed. She couldn't see any other way out. It would be easier if she were alone. But she was also responsible for her daughter, so she couldn't just proudly raise her head and walk away into the unknown. So at least the child would be in the relative warmth of safety and nourishment. And so it was that she and her entourage began to live in that very shirt. Nancy thought that the hardest thing to explain to her daughter would be what had happened. Why did they have to move from a spacious house to this squalid one? Where was her father? And why they would never see him again? However, to the woman's surprise, the girl herself started this difficult conversation, showing herself beyond her years, wise and understanding. Mom, she asked, when they were settling into their new place of residence. Dad's dead. We won't see him again. I'm afraid so, Sunshine, Nancy replied. It's just you and me now. Then said the girl seriously, I'm going to take care of you now. Daddy always said that if anything happened to him, I'd have to take care of it. Ah, dumbfounded, thought Nancy. How could you know something and not tell me? But you did try to prepare the child somehow. Well, perhaps that was the right thing to do. At first, the woman hoped this existence wouldn't last too long for them. She would get a job, not as a saleswoman, but as a cleaner, and she and her daughter would be able to return to the city, yes, again in some rented room. And what to do? After all, she'd lived like that with her mother, and nothing too bad had happened. However, the more time passed, the more it became clear that it was impossible. Called on her household work took away both time and energy. It became obvious that under such conditions she would not even be able to look for a job. But if not to fulfill the terms of the contract, she and her child would simply end up on the street. A completely hopeless situation. Gradually, Nancy came to terms with the idea of living. This is how they will have a few more years until her daughter grows up a little and will be able to help her in the household. Of course, it would be bad to exploit the child in this way, but it would give her at least a chance to find a job and return to the city. At the same time, the woman began to prepare Kelly for school, although she didn't really see how that would be possible. At the very least, she was ready to teach her herself, although this option seemed to be the worst of all possible. After all, she didn't know as much as she should, and she wanted to give her daughter a better education than she had received, so that at least she would not repeat the unenviable fate of her older relatives. For now, Nancy slowly taught her daughter to read, count, and write. To her surprise and joy, Kelly turned out to be a very imaginative child and grasped everything literally on the fly. By the time she was 5, she was already able to read syllables and print letters and do simple math calculations. The latter, it seems, was very fascinating to the girl herself. So a little over a year passed. Nancy was still trying to make some plans to return to normal life, but every day they seemed less and less realistic. She was beginning to think that there was no way out of the vicious circle in which she and her daughter found themselves. But help found them, coming from a direction from which no one could expect it. It was shortly after Kelly's birthday. It was late at night, and the girl had long been sleeping peacefully in her bed. Only Nancy had no time for sleep. In the dim light of the kerosene lamp, she looked at the photograph of her late husband and cried softly so as not to wake her daughter. From the moment they had been forced to live in that barn, it had become a kind of daily routine for her. More accurately, a nightly ritual. During the day, she had to be strong, had to work, and take care of her daughter. She had no time to grieve for Charles. But at night, she could afford to grieve enough. And on one such night, something strange came to Nancy's sensitive ears, like the creaking of a new wicket gate, not somewhere far away, but on their property. It alarmed the woman. She knew for a fact that Molly never went out at this hour, and she never had visitors. So what was it? Did thieves break in? The landlady must have heard the sound too. There was an answering creak from the side of the house. Then a loud yell from Molly, wondering who it was that was walking and what they wanted on her property. She was answered by another voice that sounded vaguely familiar to Nancy. What exactly he said the woman did not hear, but it clearly did not please her mother-in-law, who delivered a rather long and vehement monologue. The second voice answered her with no less emotional phrase. A verbal altercation ensued. Nancy sat behind Merzav, not knowing what to do, whether to go out and try to figure out what was going on, or, on the contrary, to sit quietly and keep her head down. In any case, whatever was going on outside, it looked little like a robbery or any other criminal act. It didn't make it any clearer, however, whether the acoustics in the barn made it worthwhile to intervene in the unfolding conflict. Nancy couldn't even begin to understand what it was about. While she was thinking, however, the problem resolved itself. There was the creak of the door again, this time very close. Someone had entered her barn, and she had no time to realize it. When in the faint light of the lamp she saw a face, Nancy stared and could not believe her eyes. Standing on the threshold of her humble abode was an elderly woman she recognized without a doubt, though she hadn't seen her in years. Now it was clear why the voice of the uninvited guests seemed so familiar to her. Of course it did. She had heard it more than once or twice, and it was with such cruel and accusing intonations. "Grandmother." It was all she could manage to say before she fainted. Woke up. Nancy was still in the same barn, and she didn't even immediately remember what exactly had happened. It seemed to her that she had simply not noticed how she had fallen asleep, sitting habitually on the bed with a picture of her late husband. Soon enough, however, her memory brought back the image of her grandmother standing in the doorway of her home. However, and this she took for the first minute to be either a dream or a play of her sick imagination. But as soon as she turned her head slightly, it became clear that everything that had happened was real. Her grandmother was sitting on the next bed, holding little Kelly, who was her great-granddaughter. She was talking affectionately to the girl about something, and the girl, not expressing any sign of fright, was telling her passionately about something. Nancy provoked the grandmother, noticing the stirring on the neighboring bed. Woke up. "Oh, that's good. See, Kelly, Mommy's okay. Were you scared?" "She had every reason to be," replied Nancy coldly. "Daughter, didn't I tell you not to talk to strangers?" "But Lisa said she wasn't a stranger," the girl retorted. Nancy stared at her dumbfounded at first, and then laughed half at the ridiculousness of the situation, half letting out her nervous tension. Still, she sometimes forgot that her daughter was beyond bright. But she was still a 5-year-old child with all the consequences of this fact. "And what bombed not from us?" she asked. "Calm down. Nancy, I realize that you have every reason to be both angry with me and distrustful of me. However, you have to realize that I changed." "No, I guess I haven't. That's not even the point. I haven't changed. It's the circumstances. And now I really want to make it up to you. You don't know me at all. And neither do I. The last time I saw you, I was the same age as Veda is now. Then I remember you called me that and wanted nothing to do with me." "That's true?" Kelly asked sternly, glancing at her great-grandmother. "I'm afraid so, penitent sunshine," replied the latter. "Then don't do it again," said the girl. "I won't." "My good," Lisa said. "How did you even know where to find me, by the way?" asked Nancy. "Well, it wasn't too hard, I suppose. I'm a relative after all, so I was very willing to share information. You were married to a well-known businessman in town. They wrote about you in the newspapers about how he went bankrupt, sold his apartment, and went to his mother's house in the country. I asked around your former neighbors. That's how I found out what kind of village it was. But here, too, you had to go around a few houses in the middle of the night." Nancy clarified skeptically. "Yes, they weren't happy about it, but they pointed out the right house in the end. I had planned to arrive at a more appropriate time, but I didn't expect the road to be so terrible. I don't like driving anyway. I had to go at the speed of a bicycle on your off-road course." "So you're driving a car?" Nancy was amazed. "Not on foot," grumbled Lisa. "You wouldn't be able to get here otherwise. At my age. And I'm still quite capable of driving." "Well, let's say you are." Nancy sighed heavily. "So why did you come anyway? What had to happen for you to suddenly remember I existed?" "I came to see how you were doing. I didn't expect it to be this bad. I guess you've had a bad luck with your mother-in-law. Just like your poor mother." "Oh my God. It's exactly the same situation. It's exactly the same. So now I think you and Kelly should get out of here. You shouldn't have to live in such an abominable environment. Why would you care?" Nancy couldn't take it anymore, so she raised her voice. "You said yourself that my mother had the same situation with you that I did. You hated her as much as you hated me. Did you have a guilty conscience in your old age?" Quietly, Lisa whispered angrily, "Kelly's asleep. No wonder. There's no time. I'll explain it to you in a minute, and it has nothing to do with conscience, believe me. At least not my poem," to Nancy's skeptical eye. She took a deep breath and corrected herself. No, of course I'm guilty before you. And whatever your mother's sins, real or imaginary, you're not responsible for her. Besides, she really is my own granddaughter. After my son died, I had no one else. And I treated you like this. What sins of my mother's are you talking about? Nancy was indignant. As far as I know, she tried to find a common language with you to the very last. It was you who disliked her from the very first time you met her. She didn't seem to me to be a good match for my son. Lisa confessed. But I think I could have accepted her in time, but I didn't have the chance to get to know her better. I must have missed that first impression, since I could so easily believe all the anonymity with which she was smitten, Nancy asked. Yes, different people have sent me notes of pictures that say, "Your mother is cheating on my son," and then that it's not really his daughter. They wrote that she was with him only because of her apartment, then she didn't have one, and then even worse, as if she had deliberately decided to kill him so that everything he had would remain only for her. That's when I persuaded him to sign the apartment over to me, like if something really happened to him so she wouldn't get it, and he agreed. I was sure nothing was going to happen to him anytime soon. And then, as you know, he died young. He had a heart attack, you know. It must have been so hard for me to believe. And then, after all those letters, I thought it was a sure thing. Your mother poisoned my son. And you believed it. Then I did. I'm telling you, I really didn't like her at first. Now, though, I realize it wasn't even her. It was me. I was too attached to my only child. Like I didn't want to share him with anyone, you know. How can you not believe something that so clearly confirms his own beliefs? Well, dumbfounded, Nancy retorted. But now what made you change your mind after all these years? Yes, you see, conscience. Not me, really, but the girl who wrote the notes. She's not a girl now. She's a grown woman, the same age as your mother-in-law and mother. If she were alive, she would have come to me and told me that she had written those letters and that there was not a word of truth in them. She made them up out of her head, and she'd forged the photos somehow. All because she was your father's girlfriend before he met your mom. She loved him madly and couldn't get over the breakup. I don't know what went wrong between them. All I know is that your mom had nothing to do with it. They met a little later, but this girl was literally obsessed with your dad. She was watching him. And of course, when she found out he had a new love, she hated her. But I didn't do anything about it at first. I hoped it wouldn't work out, or that he'd remember. She'd leave your mother, and everything would be fine. But when they decided to get married, that's when, you know, she couldn't take it anymore and decided to act secretly through me. That's the story. Nancy exhaled. But I'm sorry. I don't think it justifies you. You have to believe someone you don't know, and literally ruin a person's life for it. I'm not talking about me. But my mom died young, and my dad died because she thought he was torn between the two of you. Yes, Nancy. Lisa sighed again. You're right. I realize that now. But you can't undo what you've done. And you can't get your parents back. But I can at least try to help you and your little girl. You're the only family I have left. What do you suggest? What do you mean? What? Come back to the city with me to your parents' apartment. I've been renting it out all this time, but it's empty now. You can live there, especially since it's rightfully yours. I'm even willing to officially sign it over to you, and I'll help you with money for a while. I've got a lot of money saved up over a long life, but they haven't brought me any happiness. Well, I don't know. Nancy stretched out. In her soul, she was struggling with contradictory feelings. On the one hand, the offer looked just fine. Really, the apartment should logically belong to her. And Kelly would be much better off living there. Honestly, she'd probably be better off anywhere than here. Lisa's visit to Nancy was supposed to be her salvation from all her misfortunes. On the other hand, she saw before her not so much an unhappy, old and lonely woman as a man who had ruined her whole life, and though indirectly, had caused the death of her mother, and perhaps even of her father. It was simply repugnant to accept any help from her, no matter how much she assured her granddaughter of her sincere remorse. There was, however, another consideration that was not at all pleasant. There was not the slightest reason to trust the grandmother who had suddenly announced herself. She might be up to some other mischief. It wasn't very likely, of course, but I couldn't put it out of my mind. I can understand your reluctance to accept anything from me, Lisa said. But think of your daughter. She'll be going to school soon. How's she gonna get here every day? I'm sorry, Nancy, but this couldn't have come at a better time. Believe me, I'm speaking and acting from the heart. No strings attached. Take it, granddaughter. Nancy looked carefully straight into Lisa's eyes and suddenly realized, even for herself, that she believed her. Some inner instinct told her that the old woman was telling the truth and really wanted to help, or to ease her own soul before her imminent death. After all, at her age, you really don't know which day might be your last. Okay, Nancy stretched out. Here's the thing. The morning is wiser in the evening. Come on, let's get to bed. It's getting late. We don't have much room, but I can go with Kelly. Why don't you guys come over here on my bed? We'll figure out what we're gonna do in the morning. You're not going anywhere right now anyway. Lisa agreed. The next morning, they hurriedly packed their things, to Molly's indignant cries. It seemed that the woman had gotten so used to having a free labor that she didn't want to let her go. But alas, there was no real possibility of keeping the woman at her place. On entering the apartment where she had been born and had spent the first years of her life, Nancy experienced mixed feelings. The atmosphere was exactly the same as it had been under her parents, and this novella is a memory of those childhood years, which were still happy. A dad and mom still alive. And how good they all were until everything went downhill. Kelly, who had never seen a city or her own apartment in her life, loved it here. She was genuinely amazed by the simplest things. Hot water, giving straight from the faucet to go to the toilet right in the house warmth, without the need to make firewood and stoke the stove. In addition, the girl now had her own desk, where she could both draw and study. Undoubtedly, it was much more comfortable than sitting on the bed, putting under a notebook or album sheet of some kind, and even great-grandmother, having learned about her interest in math, gave her a children's book with many entertaining and puzzle problems. So Kelly was perfectly happy. And Nancy, to be frank, was glad to be back in town, and would have been glad even if the last terrible year had simply not existed. Fresh air was fresh, and yes, and her own vegetables were certainly a good thing. Still, she missed the conveniences of the city, and the stores, and the noisy streets, and all the other hustle and bustle that had no place in the village under any guise. Sometimes it began to seem to Nancy that Lisa had become a real guardian angel to her and little Kelly. Only a month after returning to the city, the woman managed to find a job, and it was as a sales consultant in a clothing store, with a very good salary. And her life slowly began to return to normal. In addition, quite quickly, Nancy became convinced that she could leave Kelly with her grandmother without any fears. The latter did not dote on her great-granddaughter. Or maybe she just spent too much time alone. And she was glad of any company, and at the same time the object of care. And the girl herself became fast friends with Lisa. Nancy's relations with her grandmother were still strained. Whatever she did, no matter how hard she tried, she could not win her granddaughter's favor. The woman herself was not happy about this state of affairs, but she could not help it. The resentment was too strong. The damage done was too great. The only thing she had the nobility to do was not to turn Kelly against Lisa and not to prevent their communication. However, she would not let her grandmother even on the doorstep of her apartment, and brought her daughter to her. And one day there came a moment when they all rejoiced at this behavior of hers. One day, returning from work, Nancy gathered the entourage from Lisa, and they went home together. Barely putting the key in the keyhole, the woman realized something was wrong. The door was not locked, only slightly covered, and not very neatly at that. Nancy knew for a fact that she could not have left it in this condition. She always checked all sorts of things thoroughly before she left, including coming back several times almost halfway across the street to make sure the apartment was perfectly safe. Inside, however, it was chaos. All the drawers were overturned, things from the closets unceremoniously thrown on the floor, even the beds. Even the beds were a horrifying sight. The linens had been stripped from them, and the mattresses had clearly been exposed to some kind of cutting object. It was obvious at a glance that something had been searched, very thoroughly and meticulously. Of course, the first thing Nancy did was to call the police. The law enforcers arrived and carefully examined the crime scene, but did not seem to be able to find any significant clues. They then invited the homeowner to take a look at her belongings and tell them what was missing. That's where the strangest and most frightening thing came to light. Nothing was missing. Not that there were a lot of valuable things in the house, but still potential thieves would have something to gain. However, and silver jewelry, Nancy, and TV, and a laptop, bought for study, found here in the apartment, albeit not in their places, so the perpetrators were not the target. Robbery, concluded one of the police officers. Unless, of course, you had, for example, some documents or other things that might be of interest to a particular person and were not in this apartment. There is nothing like that, Nancy said, confused. Look, I work as a store clerk, and you're implying that my house might contain dangerous dirt. You're a store clerk now, the cop said. You used to be the wife of a prominent businessman. As far as I know, I'm not implying anything, but I had to ask you this question anyway. All right, if you are firmly convinced that nothing of the sort could have been looked for here, I'm sure, immediately, replied Nancy. Good. Then another theory. Maybe you just wanted revenge for something. Do you have any enemies? Maybe someone who has a reason to hold a grudge against you. Unless it's an ex-mother-in-law, Nancy chuckled. But I don't think the old woman would have come all the way from the country to trash my apartment. You know, I've seen so many interesting situations over the years that I wouldn't be surprised if she had. Anyway, until we find out who did this, I wouldn't advise you to stay in this apartment. But where am I going to go? Nancy was indignant. Well, you know, that's not a question for me. The policeman shrugged his shoulders. But since this isn't a robbery, it could be personal. Not a sure thing, of course. But still, it's up to you. But it might not be safe here. After some thought, Nancy decided that it would be better for Kelly to stay with Lisa for a while. She couldn't bring herself to move in with her, even for a while. Even though she didn't mind at all. Even the possible threat to her life did not frighten her, as the prospect of being under the same roof with her own grandmother for a long time. So they lived for another 2 or 3 weeks. The police promised to call as soon as they knew something, but they never heard from them again. Fortunately, there were no new frightening incidents either. Nancy was even beginning to think that if all was quiet, she might as well take her daughter back home. Sure, she came to see her every day, but she still couldn't be completely calm when Kelly wasn't home at night. After all, if suddenly someone was actually looking for some specific documents, assuming Nancy might have them, what was to stop them from breaking into Lisa's place? For example, figuring she might have hidden them at her grandmother's. And to Nancy's surprise, it turned out soon enough that she wasn't too far from the truth. The compromise that was apparently being sought in their apartment was not even Lisa's, but Kelly's, who, of course, had no idea about it. And it turned out at the moment, when among her notebooks, brought from the village, the girl found a memory card. The kind that are usually inserted into cell phones. Fortunately, she didn't throw it away or try to look at the information it contained. Instead, she showed it to Lisa. The woman, after a moment's hesitation, contacted Nancy. An hour later, the woman was driving home with the memory card in her purse. Some premonition told her that it was this small black rectangle that had caused the mayhem in her apartment. Before she reported her find to the police, however, she decided it was worth taking a look at its contents for herself. What if there is some innocent video of a corporate party? Or an archive of photos of her beloved dead cat Molly? Or maybe the card was empty. Strictly speaking, Nancy had expected to see absolutely anything, up to and including a detailed videotape of some horrible crime being committed. But she wasn't prepared for what was actually on the memory card. After a quick look through all the files, she rushed to call the police again. After listening to her, the officer on duty assured her that he would send officers immediately. However, they had to go not to Nancy's house, but to the village where Molly lived. Besides the fact that the police now had evidence that she had committed a serious crime, they also had every reason to fear for her own life, and they were just in time. When they pulled up, some suspicious type had already finished pouring gasoline on it and was now about to set it on fire with the landlady, sleeping peacefully inside. A few days later, one of the policemen arrived at Nancy's house, where little Kelly had already returned. As it turned out, it was the same one who had arrived on her first call. Now, however, he had an extra star on each of his epaulets. Here, he said, right from the doorstep, he came to express his official gratitude to you. Thanks to you, we have caught an extremely dangerous gang, which we have been hunting for decades and unofficially. What was that for? Because again, thanks to you, I was in charge of the operation. And as you may have noticed, I got an additional rank for it. No way. It's basically a pure coincidence. What does that have to do with me? Maybe so, but still, what if it wasn't an accident? Oh, come on. Anyway, I think you'd like to know some details about this case. I can help you with that. Of course, it's within the limits of what I can tell you not to harm the investigation, but it just so happens that I already know some things, Nancy remarked. For instance, that it was my mother-in-law who killed her husband, and then mine, in conspiracy with some bandits. I didn't quite understand why it took her so long to do it, though. Slow-acting poison, the policeman explained. But a very trustworthy man dies of what looks like a heart attack. There's no way to trace it. The substance is eliminated from the body very quickly, virtually undetectable. If it wasn't for this tape, we'd never know the truth. That's right. Why would she keep it in the barn where she sent me and my daughter to live? I mean, any one of us could have accidentally found it, which is exactly what happened. Well, she kept it as protection from her own accomplices. She couldn't have survived this long without it. They tried to kill her right after they found out she didn't have it. Yeah, it was stupid of her to report them missing. Panicked. Besides, she had no other options. Someone to send to your apartment to try and find her. Although you're right, it would have been better for her to stay put either way, having discovered it missing. If it hadn't been for the mayhem in your apartment, you might not have even noticed that memory card. And as for your second question, she didn't keep it hidden in some old notebook. And then, when she gave it to your daughter, she mixed it up, discovered it. By the way, right on the day you left her, but never found a way to discreetly change the notebooks back. So that's what she was so excited about that day, Nancy realized. Well, that much is clear, but the rest is still a mystery to me. What kind of person would kill their own son? What could possibly be the reasons for such an act? But first of all, Charles was not her son. Yeah, don't look so surprised. In fact, he probably didn't even know it himself. His real mother died when he was very young, and his father took Molly in, first as a nanny for the boy, and then married her. As I recall, your husband was assured all his adult life that this woman was his real mother, but even so, I still don't understand. She raised him, fed him, educated him, was so nice to him. You know, I honestly don't get it either. Well, on an emotional level, I guess her hatred for his whole family was too great. Well, that's just gonna confuse the two of us. Let me tell you the whole story from the beginning. And if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. You're right, Nancy nodded. That would be most convenient. Well then, it all began, perhaps, when Molly was not even alive. But there was her father, a young but promising businessman who shared everything with an old school friend. As you may have guessed, with the father of her future husband. These two, as far as I understood, were inseparable since childhood, went to the same group of kindergarten, then got into the same class. They went to university together in high school. They graduated together and started a small business together. Their business prospered. However, at some point one of the partners began to notice some oddities, that somewhere the balance does not add up, or something else. At first it was small things, but then the violations became more and more serious. It was already becoming dangerous for the whole business, and the owner could not find the one who was to blame. He had already checked the accountant and all the staff, even those who, it would seem, could not have access to such serious things. There's no way to appeal to the competent authorities. Naturally, he didn't want to, so as not to incur suspicion on himself. In general, as I understand it, he was going to quietly, without making a fuss, fire the culprit of all these problems, somehow deal with the violations, and quietly move on with his life. However, the further he dug, the more he realized that only one person could do such a thing: his business partner, and consequently, Molly's father. She herself was still in high school at the time. Of course, the owner of the firm for a long time did not want to believe it, but eventually realized that the evidence is irrefutable. Then he came to his friend with a business proposition. He fixes everything he has done, returns the stolen money, and voluntarily leaves the firm. For what reasons? Let him think of his own. But from that moment their paths diverge, and they have no further dealings with each other. It would seem to be an ideal option for a dishonest partner. But he blows up, saying it's as much my business as it is yours. And since that's how you feel about me, why don't you and I just split it fair and square? We built it together, and now you'll get all the good stuff. Anyway, they couldn't reach a peaceful agreement. And then the honest partner went to the police and ratted out Molly's dad. He ended up keeping the business, although he had to sweat a lot to bring it back to its former level of development. And his friend went to prison, and for a long time. He died for a long time, born with some not too pleasant disease. His wife could not bear the loss of her husband, and soon followed him, and their 15-year-old daughter went to an orphanage. It is clear that she started a grudge, considering her father's former friend to be to blame for all her troubles. She didn't manage to get a proper education, nothing at all. All her parents' property was sold off for their debts. The only thing left was a plot of land in the village, which their family used to use as a summer house, and even that played against Molly, so that she could count on at least some apartment from the state. But with this plot and house, it turned out that even this she is not entitled to, because any but housing she has. In general, she left the orphanage angry at the whole world, but most of all at her father's old friend. Lived in the village, interrupted by casual earnings, until one day she saw an ad in the newspaper that a little boy who had lost his mother needed a nanny. Of course, she had no desire to sit with the infant, but when she saw the name of the employer, she realized this was her chance for revenge. She had a lot of patience, and she waited first for the wedding, and then for the boy to grow up, and a little into the management of the business, so that when his father died, the business would definitely go to him and not to someone else. But why go to all this trouble? Nancy wondered. Up to this moment she had served with bated breath. Yes, because she would hardly have been able to ruin the business with her husband alive. And that's exactly what she wanted. I think murder just seemed too small for her. Not enough to satisfy her thirst for revenge. She wanted someone from her abuser's family to experience the hardships she had to endure. So she's the one who ruined the suit, the business. Yeah, well, I'd have to say you were her unwitting accomplice. Charles was very attracted to you, and therefore began to pay less time to work affairs, and then even left for a month on a wedding trip, which gave her full freedom of action. But that was later. First, she took out his father. In fact, that's where the gang shows up in the story. What were we so successful in picking up the other day? We haven't figured out exactly how she got in touch with these people, but they gave her a way to commit the crime, and they sold her the poison. That was their primary function. Let's say Nancy wrinkles her brow, but I still don't get it. She ruined the business. We had to sell the apartment and move in with her. You'd think that's what she was after. Why kill Charles too? It was her plan to destroy the whole family. Besides, she couldn't have been too pleased to have you living in her house, and there was no way to evict you while he was alive. He could have tried to start a new business. He might have succeeded. And then everything would have been ruined. All her plans and her hopes. Nancy, are you all right? The woman gasped, covered her mouth with her hand. My back was against the wall I was standing against. The policeman helped her to the couch and sat down, poured water, and only after drinking it was she able to speak. You said she wanted to destroy the whole family. Then I'm afraid she did. She didn't put you in the barn out of some twisted pity. She targeted your daughter, the last member of a hated family, as her next victim. Who knows what would have happened if your grandmother had been so fortunate as not to remember your existence? Yes, Nancy muttered, and now everything was falling into place. Well, thank you very much for the information. I'm not sure I needed it so badly, though. Well, philosophized the policeman. It would have come to you sooner or later anyway. After all, if you didn't know the details, you'd look for them, and you'd still hear them at the trial. He left, and Nancy spent a long time trying to come to her senses and digest what she had just learned. She thought of the incredible twists and turns she could make in life. And now it turned out that her kind and cheerful mother-in-law turned out to be a real monster. And her grandmother, who she'd spent her whole life thinking was the worst person in the world. Turns out she saved her daughter, even if she didn't know it. The thought turned Nancy's mind upside down. She realized that she no longer felt the disgust she had for Lena. Only now did she truly feel grateful to her for pulling her and Kelly out of the nightmare they had lived in for a year. The very next day, she showed up at her grandmother's house with flowers and a cake. The women talked for a long time and cried a lot. In the end, they sat up so late that Nancy and Kelly had to spend the night at Lisa's house, and for the first time, the thought didn't cause her granddaughter's soul any repulsion. The following year, Kelly went to school. Not an easy one. Lisa hustled to get her accepted into a math grammar school. There her abilities quickly appreciated at face value and began to prophesize her great future. The girl studied very well. And no one was surprised by the fact that after 11 years, she decided to leave to enter one of the prestigious universities in the capital. True, Lisa, who was one of the first to notice the talent of her great-granddaughter, did not live to see this happy moment. She passed away shortly after Kelly went to the first grade, after spending very little time with her newfound family again. This came as a major blow to Nancy, although in her mind, she knew it was coming. I'd lived a good life, Lisa said shortly before she died. And at the end of it, I managed to do some real good. What are you saying, Grandma? Nancy was outraged at the time. At what end do you have to send your branch to university and then get married? Oh, my dear, I don't think I'll have time to marry you either, let alone a branch. But it's okay. Don't get upset. I'm already very old, and I'm really glad that I'll die knowing that I've received your forgiveness. The old woman's words proved prophetic. Nancy had indeed remarried, but Nana was indeed not destined to see it. The meeting with her second spouse took place a few years after she was buried. Surprisingly, it happened almost exactly the same way as the first time. A man whose car ran into the store where Nancy worked for new pants. He wasn't a businessman, though, just a delivery man. And the store was no longer a boutique, but a cheap establishment. Why do you need new pants? Nancy wondered, listening to his confused explanation. How am I going to show up like this to a customer? He wondered. It's at least a fine. And if it turns out to be very scandalous, so and even dismissal, it's not a big stain. Smirked the woman with hysteria in the toilet on the second floor. That's all. That's what he did. 2 weeks later, he showed up at the store again. It was Nancy's shift. Don't tell me. Half joking, half wary, she said, that now you've spilled coffee on your jacket. Honestly, that was the idea. The man smirked, but I decided to dispense with those cheap excuses. The thing is, I really like you. Let me ask you out on a date. My name is Charles, by the way. At this point, the woman almost fainted. for the second time in her life, but she did go on a date. This time, the relationship had no negative impact on her work. In addition, the new suitor was approved by the most important censor, Lisa, so 6 months later they got married. A year later, Nancy's daughter had a baby brother. Subscribe and click the bell. Miranda was agitated and excited. She had been busy in the kitchen since morning. In the middle of the day, her refrigerator was no longer able to hold the numerous appetizers and salads. On the stove, there was a huge pot of roast from the oven, came intoxicating aromas of such a pie with berry filling. The woman was still circling between the table and the cupboard, figuring out what else she could create from the food at her disposal. Despite the abundance of dishes, Miranda felt that she had prepared too little food and the guests would go hungry. And the guests were expected to be important. A few days ago, Miranda and Sebastian Jenkins' daughter accepted a marriage proposal from her fiancé David for the city. And today, Jenkins was scheduled to meet David's out-of-town parents, and Miranda was terribly afraid of making a mess of things in front of her new in-laws. She looked thoughtfully into the refrigerator, wondering if she should add some raw slices to the existing slices. When Sebastian's husband entered the kitchen, assessing the situation, he walked over to his wife, put his arm around her and gently pushed her away from the stock of provisions. "Miranda, calm down," he said affectionately. "You've already cooked enough to feed a company of soldiers. The guests won't eat it. They won't even be able to taste it." Do you think the woman was hesitant to go to the refrigerator? "I keep thinking there's something missing. Everything is enough, and even with a surplus," reassured her husband. "You'll see for yourself. Then we'll finish it for 2 more days, as if you're not happy about it." On the business of Miranda's husband, he laughed. "Glad, of course. A kitchen full of goodies. Of course I'm glad. I see you're sweet and sour, and the meat's confused. Why are you trying so hard?" "Me and Kevin are nervous," my wife confessed frankly. "What if we don't like each other? What if something goes wrong? The first impression is the strongest. David's parents won't like some little thing. That's it. And we have to communicate with them later about the wedding, and in general with relatives to be friends. And there's a big age difference between us. Maybe we won't hit it off." Sebastian and Miranda married late after 30, and their daughter was born even closer to 40 years old. Now the daughter was 22 years old, and the parents were approaching 60 years. In the family of the future son-in-law, everything was exactly the opposite. For city elders played a wedding almost immediately after school, and a year later gave birth to a son. They weren't even 40 yet, and their future daughter-in-law's parents could act as their parents at the same time. Miranda, it was very unsettling. "Don't worry prematurely," Sebastian reassured his wife. "Don't you think we don't have many young acquaintances? A lot, and we communicate with all of them somehow. At the very least, apply your professional skills to go for the city. We're fascinated by all native. Extinguishes the oven and let's go. We'll have a little rest. We'll have some tea. Worse? No. For the guests than a tired and withdrawn hostess. They'll be here in 300 hours. That'll give you time to catch your breath and take a shower. And I'll set the table while you're here. Yeah, Lisa will help. Don't worry, we'll make it perfect." "Oh, my heart is racing." Miranda sighed. "And if something goes wrong, Lisa will be upset too." Lisa was the name of the Jenkins daughter, the bride-to-be, which is what all the fuss was about. Actually, Miranda wanted to name her daughter Lisa, and Sebastian was fine with it. But as often happens, the young mother had no time to deal with the paperwork for the baby, and this duty was entrusted to the newly minted father. But here's the trouble. On the day when Sebastian was going to visit the registry office, he was attacked by some insidious virus. In the morning, the man felt only a slight malaise. But in the middle of the day, he had a fever, ran a very bad runny nose, covered his throat. Somehow Jenkins waited until work was over. He had asked his bosses to leave early so that he could get to the registry office before closing time. Overcoming weakness, he got to the office, but because of a runny nose, he pronounced his daughter's name inaudibly. At the end of the day, the woman who was working on the birth certificate did not ask him to repeat the name, but wrote it down as she heard it. Sebastian himself was in agony and fever. Neither did he reread the documents issued to him, just took the papers and went to his parents. He reasoned that it was not worth bringing a contagion into a house where a newborn child lived. He was given a week's sick leave. A few days later, when the weakness receded, and Sebastian, taking advantage of his free time, as a decent parent, took copies of the documents to the clinic, to the milk kitchen, to the accounting department of the institute where he and Miranda worked, and to some other organizations that had to be notified of the baby's arrival. This is how Miranda found out that her daughter's name was Robert and not Lisa, only 10 days after the birth certificate was issued. And that document had already been seen by so many organizations that it would have been too much of a hassle to redo it. The woman grumbled at Sebastian, of course, for a long time. But to the name of her daughter got used to unexpectedly, quickly. Especially her mother-in-law, having learned about the mishap, said with a laugh. And that she even suits this name. Look how thin and flexible she is. Lisa is Lisa. Jenkins was indeed born skinny and thin. No counter and no tugging. There was no infant resemblance at all, but the flexibility and firmness was there from birth. And that's what my mother-in-law accurately pointed out. Miranda had to put a lot of effort into swaddling the baby. Lisa turned from diapers, described from diapers, and even using the decay of legs, somehow expressed. This is how she grew up slender, thin, flexible, and willful. But despite the girl's unruly character, her mother loved her very much and worried about her daughter. Almost as much as in her childhood. That's why she was worried now before meeting her future relatives. She wanted everything to go off without a hitch. Good, at least with David, future son-in-law Jenkins, were familiar with a long time ago. We cannot worry unnecessarily. Who did the bloodline decide to marry? David was a positive guy in every sense, and Miranda and Sebastian liked him very much. Young people met right after graduation. David and his classmates celebrated the awarding of diplomas in the same restaurant as Robert fellow students. The girl studied at the PhilFac, and David in a technical university at the Faculty of Road Maintenance. Girls and men quickly took notice of each other. They got reacquainted and soon mingled. This evening formed several strong, stable couples, and Robert and David were among them. True, with the wedding they lasted longer than the rest of the fellow students. Robert wanted to find a good and steady job before the wedding. Since childhood, she dreamed of becoming a journalist. But in her time, she did not get enough points in the profile faculty, so she applied for the philological faculty. Starting from the second year, the girl tried herself as a freelance correspondent in different city and regional editions. But quite quickly it became clear that the text was not cramped. She wanted to illustrate her words at least with photos, or better, with video. That's the only way, the girl thought. It is possible to penetrate the modern news consumer, to convey to him what you really want to say. Therefore, having received a diploma, the girl began to storm television. It took her 6 months to get on a local TV channel, and another 6 months to get a foothold there and become in demand. Even a relatively popular correspondent, whose stories viewers waited for, watched with attention, and discussed later both in kitchens and on social networks. All the while, David, immediately after graduation, having got a job in one of the city's construction trusts, courted the rising star of the screen and waited for her consent to the wedding. And then he did. Lisa came running home an hour before the guests arrived. She brought the drinks, helped set the table, shared the abundance and variety of treats. The out-of-towners showed up on time. And half an hour after the start of the feast, Miranda realized that she was worried for nothing. Kelly and John, David's parents, turned out to be very nice people, calm, friendly, cheerful. Kelly was a housewife. She called it still herself. And in between, taking care of the house. John was engaged in entrepreneurship, kept a small manufacturing company, but did not want to talk in detail about his work. "Give at least here to rest from business." The man joked back. Make friends with the parents of the future son-in-law managed to quickly enough, and the difference in age did not prevent rapprochement. So Zagorodny Sr. quickly agreed that they will not impose their wedding format on the children. Let the celebration will be held the way the young people want. "I think it's the best option," Kelly said. "I remember my own wedding with horror. Mom and Dad said since we all pay for everything, we decide who to invite and where to party." And what did we get? A room full of some strange older relatives for the ransom. In the best rustic traditions, musical Toastmaster with silly contests. I wasn't even allowed to choose a dress like I wanted in the registry office. It was some kind of cake. In white rose-colored glasses, I still cannot look at the photos. "Yeah," backed up John. "It was a tiring event, but it's never too late to get it right." Miranda smiled softly. "Now in the registry office, you can order a simple registration. Not real, but solemn and even away. At least in nature, at the beach at home. And have a new wedding just the way you want it." "Yes," Sebastian confirmed. "We did that for our 25th wedding anniversary. The couple wanted to be romantic. So we did it again. We rented a Miranda dress. They organized a tuxedo for me. And we renewed our vows at the wedding palace. And you know, I was skeptical at first, but at the end of it, I got emotional. I think even more than I did at my real wedding," he laughed. John hummed skeptically, but Kelly was fascinated by the idea, and she began to ask with curiosity and interest how to organize everything, how much the ceremony cost, what are the requirements. Slightly frightened by his wife's enthusiasm, Zagorodny tried to restrain her. "Kelly, wait. While we now have a wedding of children is more important. How about we do both ceremonies on the same day?" Lisa immediately suggested it. That would be so great, so romantic. And again, the concept. Intergenerational. Continuity within the family. It's like nothing anyone's ever done before. The discussion went to a new level. The women loved the idea. David, as the groom, supported the thread in everything. But the older men quickly got tired of the enthusiastic plans of the group and retired to the balcony for a smoke. Having returned from a smoke break, they began to change plates on the table and finally brought hot food from the kitchen. Only with this they managed to interrupt the conversation and direct it in a new direction. "Everything is so delicious," John said delightedly. "I've never had a roast like this before. Miranda, are you a cook by any chance?" "No, are you?" laughed the venerable Miranda. "I'm an honored pensioner. Cooking is a hobby. I used to work in a completely different field. I'm a psychologist, and not just a psychologist, but a doctor of psychology," emphasized Sebastian. With a meaningful thumbs up. "I've never been able to reach such heights. Sebastian and I worked at the same institute," Miranda explained. "Only he stopped at the master's thesis and abandoned his doctoral thesis. But I had the patience." "Wait," John interrupted the woman. "What do you mean? Were there psychologists in the Soviet Union? It seemed to me that they only proliferated in the last 10 to 15 years." The Jenkins looked at each other and laughed. Even Lisa laughed heartily at her future father-in-law's delusions. "You're right about something, John. From the media," said Miranda. "Active popularization of psychology in our country really started only in the early '90s. But this science itself is not the first 10 years or even 100 years old. And in the Soviet Union it certainly was. Only in those years there was more demand for social psychology. The course was to work with the team on the compatibility of its participants. There were psychologists at schools, of course, at factories, at large organizations, but their activities were aimed at strengthening the corporate spirit, as they would say nowadays. And for the most part, specialists working in psychoneurological dispensaries were engaged in solving personal problems and detecting diseases, and they were of little value. I'd worked there for a while too. I was interested in interaction with specific people. I went into this profession wanting to help people, but then I saw the attitude to such help and went into science. How did you find out about the profession in the first place if it wasn't on the radar? Kelly asked. Why did it suddenly occur to you to become a psychologist? After all, you can help people in many places. Oh, that's a very interesting story. David suddenly cut in. It's not even a story of career guidance, it's a family story. Tell it, Miranda. Well, the short story was Jenkins, but her future son-in-law interrupted her. No, don't. Just tell it short, like they told me. So you already know it all by heart. Sebastian mocked the young man. So what? David objected. I like the way Miranda tells it. And the story is interesting. And Mom and Dad will understand everything about you. But now we're intrigued. John said insistently. Miranda, after such publicity you can't help telling. In fact, John did not want the conversation to return to the discussion of the wedding and the decorative registration of his wife. For the sake of it, he was willing to listen even to a family tale, though he didn't really like such stories. But he liked the wedding ceremony even less, and he didn't want to participate in such a reenactment. John expected that the story would distract his wife from the idea given at the beginning of the evening, and then she would forget about it. So he enthusiastically began to persuade his future relative to tell the story. However, Miranda especially did not resist. After a roast with tea and cake, she began her story. Miranda Kendall. In the future, Jenkins was born in a small village Putilova 200 kilometers from the regional center. She was the youngest child in the family. Her parents had 2 older sons and a daughter. And like all younger children, Miranda grew up spoiled and loved. Although there was nothing to spoil the girl, they lived modestly. Christopher, Miranda's father, worked on the collective farm as a tractor driver. Mother Cindy Larkins worked there as a milkmaid. Simple, quiet, hard-working people. They received an average wage, kept a large farm. And Badja was chewed up at home. However, a simple countryman could be called only Christopher. With Cindy in it, all was a little more interesting. Christopher was a man of the countryside. Miranda's mother had been born on the road and had lived her entire childhood there with her parents and numerous siblings. Miranda Larkin's grandfather was chairman of the Putilov Collective Farm. Grandmother Clara worked there as a bookkeeper. Daughter Cindy was born to them just after the war. After about a year, grandfather and grandmother tried to give education to all their children. They encouraged them to read books and be interested in various sciences. Good studies at school. This approach paid off. Cindy's 2 older sisters had already graduated from universities in the city and were slowly making their way into the world. The older brothers were excellent in school. They were predicted a bright future. And Cindy herself studied diligently and was regularly praised by teachers. The girl planned to become a doctor, but fate ordered otherwise. When Cindy was 10 years old, her parents were arrested. Her father was accused of embezzlement and misappropriation of collective farm property. Mother was taken with him for company. Reasoned that the chairman of the collective farm could steal state property with the complicity of the bookkeeper. In fact, there was no embezzlement. There were only inconvenient nationality of the father and an anonymous letter that came on him to the district administration. And then the punitive machine spun very quickly. One evening, 3 children of school children, Cindy and her 2 brothers, were left without parents. Where were the adults taken away? Where to look for them? How long will they serve their sentence? Neither the younger children nor their older sisters, who had traveled from the city to arrange custody, were able to find out. Much later, the older sister told Cindy that the alleged embezzlement was just a pretext for arrest. And at the trial, the prosecutors went all out, portraying the parents as enemies of Soviet power, Zionists, terrorists, and God knows who else, simply because of their nationality. As a child, from the conversations of her elders, Cindy realized that everything was the fault of her parents' positions. Everything is the fault of her parents' positions in a small collective farm. The chairman of the accountant is practically the upper class, the elite. There is always someone who is jealous and wants to live in the light. So, to live a quiet life, you have to keep your head down. So reasoned the 10-year-old girl, especially if you come from a Jewish family. And if your parents were arrested and taken to the camps, it's better to live modestly, but quietly and peacefully, than to make your way into the world, risking your life. No, Cindy didn't drop out. She graduated from high school with honors and even turned from Cindy to Cindy Larkins, but she did not stop reading books and interested in science and medicine, in particular, subscribing to various general education magazines, watching educational programs on television when it appeared in the house. She was a woman, intelligent, erudite, finely sensitive with excellent artistic taste, but having finished 10 years of school, did not go to the city to enter the institute, and got a job in her native collective farm on the simplest and most inconspicuous job. So she spent her whole life in it, refusing even to be promoted to foreman of milkmaids. It seemed to her that even such an insignificant career advancement would bring danger to her and her family. Cindy's older brothers and sisters left for cities and towns. The girl stayed in her native village. For a while she lived in her parents' house. But soon after graduation, Cindy married Christopher Kendall and moved into a hut, which was allocated to him by the collective farm. The girl for a long time rejected the advances of the visiting guy. It even came to the point that she hid from him in the backyard. But Christopher was persistent and continued to pursue Cindy persistently and methodically. In the end, Cindy summoned him for a conversation and told him about her biography, about her arrested parents. Should you ruin your life by associating with the daughter of an enemy of the people? She asked, having finished the story. So it is necessary. Angrily, replied Christopher. We have a son is not responsible for the father, I forgot, and a daughter is not responsible for her father either. And knowing where these enemies of the people come from, a month later they got married, and a few years later the young built their own house and moved there with their first child. And the house of their beloved parents was empty and decrepit by the time of the birth of their youngest daughter, Miranda. From it remained almost one hulk towering among the weeds and frightening the children, the failing windows. Cindy sometimes took her daughter there. The two of them would walk around the property, jumping on the floor balcony inside the ruins. And Cindy Larkins would tell how things used to be here, and Miranda would listen and memorize. The girl got into the habit of visiting the old house once a week, of spending some time in it talking about the weathered walls, about her life. It seemed to her that her grandparents were invisibly present among these ruins, listening to her and delighted granddaughters us stories. Miranda decided to visit the abandoned house twice a week and strictly adhered to the schedule. Only in winter did she sometimes miss visits in the worst of the frost. The year the girl turned 10, the winter was warm and snowy. One January day, the girl sat in the ruins until almost dusk, telling at home how she and her relatives celebrated the new year. She caught up only when a snowstorm started outside. Miranda, she realized, had to get out, or the path to the street was barely trampled. She'd notice in no time. Heavily, shuffling her feet through the snow, the girl got out on the shriveled porch of the house and saw that a man was sitting on the Leningrad. Looking closer, she realized that the alien had been here for a long time. Small drifts of snow had managed to gather on his shoulders and top. Miranda was wary, but she realized she had nowhere to go. She would have to leave the lot anyway. She couldn't just sit around. She moved forward with determination, reasoned that if a man tried to attack her, she'd raise a ruckus. A dozen meters from the family ruins stood an apartment building across the street, another. Would anyone hear her screams? Barely past the lot. The path was already partially snowed over. The girl equaled the fence and found herself a couple steps away from the stranger. Looking closer, Miranda realized that on the remnants of the fence sat a woman, almost an old woman. She was dressed in some inconceivable rags. Her head was covered with a scarf. The old woman's face was unfamiliar, and it was puzzling. The village, though it had grown in recent years, but it was still small. All the inhabitants knew each other in one way or another, but this woman Miranda had never seen. She could have sworn it. The old woman sat motionless and paid no attention to the girl, didn't even turn her head in her direction. She did not seem to see Miranda. The girl began to look at the stranger and suddenly saw that tears were flowing down the alien's cheeks. "Grandmother, why are you crying?" loudly asked Miranda. The old woman did not answer, and it seemed she did not even hear that she was being addressed. The girl repeated the question and then began to shake the old woman by the shoulders. "You're all right. What's wrong? Why are you sitting here?" inquired she. "You're freezing. We should go home. Would you like me to walk you home?" Miranda's efforts were successful. The stranger finally snapped out of her trance and saw the girl. Hearing what she was being told, the old woman only sighed and shook her head. "There's no place for me to go, sweetheart," she said hoarsely, as if in a chicken voice. "I have no home." "But where did you come from?" Miranda wondered. "From afar, sweetheart," said the old woman, still monotonous, like a broken record. "I'll never make it back." How could it be? The girl was seriously upset. For some reason, a strange woman had caught her eye. "You can't just sit here, can you? It'll be night soon. The blizzard's coming. You're freezing to death." The old woman just nodded her head. The prospect of freezing to death didn't seem to bother her at all. "Come with me," Miranda said decisively. "Come and visit us. My parents are good, don't be afraid. And the house is big enough for you to sleep here." And then decide what to do next, she demandingly pulled the stranger by the arm. "Come on, let's go, or he'll notice the road. We'll never make it. My goodness, you've turned into a snowdrift." The girl managed to push the old woman out of the way, rising heavily from the debris of the fence. The stranger followed her. Miranda held the old woman's hand tightly, afraid that she would suddenly change her mind or simply get lost in the snow swirls. They reached the house after dark. Cindy Larkins was peering out the window and, seeing her daughter, jumped out on the porch. "Where they carry you grumpily," she grumbled. I kept my eyes peering. "It's nighttime. The storm is raging. And you are schlepped somewhere." The woman noticed the guest, which her daughter persistently pulled behind her all, and remained silent, then hesitantly spoke. "Hello, Mom. It's Grandma who's lost," Miranda explained. "I brought her to us. She says she doesn't know where her home is or where to go. Let her wait here tonight. We can't let her go out in this weather. We can't." The mother agreed and turned to the old woman and invited her to come in, please. "Here, develop here. You can hang your coat here." Cindy Larkins helped the alien to undress. Under the coat turned out to be worn another one, and under it a glass fungus sole of strange color. It seemed never to have been cleaned once in its life when all the outer clothes were hoisted on a hanger. The old woman appeared skinny, if not skinny. The shawl from her head, she was reeling, and Cindy Larkins had evidently taken to fiddling, fitting both his topcoat and Valenki. By the stove, Mama was pestering Miranda. It was Granny who said she came from far away. "So she's not from our village. I don't know her. See if you recognize her. Maybe she's a local after all. They say old people sometimes forget where they live." "It happens," the woman responded. She took the old woman to the corner between the stove and the table, the warmest place in the kitchen, seated her on a chair covered with a soft thread, leaned over the guest, looked into her face, and suddenly froze, scrutinizing his features. For several minutes, the two women, old and young, gazing at each other. Miranda became subdued, but looked at them both. She was surprised to hear her mother suddenly ask the old woman in a stern voice, "Laura?" The alien nodded in response and, in turn, asked the landlady Cindy a question. "Cindy Larkins is now Kendall," mumbled the woman and cried. Hugging her guest tightly and resting her nose on the top of her head, the old woman picked up Cindy Larkins, but with both hands she pushed her nose into her chest and, from the sounds of it, cried too. Miranda watched the scene with all her eyes. I think she even forgot to blink. The door slammed behind her. Christopher's father entered the house, After assessing the situation, he loudly asked Cindy what was going on. Yes, Cindy, the sane woman, raised her face at her husband, flooded with tears. To Miranda's surprise, it was completely happy. "Meet Christopher," she said. "This is your mother-in-law, Clara. Sarah is my mother." Hugs she did not ponder. And the old woman, though she turned to her son-in-law, continued to hold on to her daughter with both hands. Christopher was quick to recognize the situation. "Pleased to meet you," he said politely to the guest. "So why are you standing there? Let's get the table ready. Grandma, you go, we need to feed. See, mother is busy. Let's manage." He shook the girl by the shoulder, and only then Miranda was able to shake off her surprised stupor and began to organize in the kitchen. Slar was released from the colony 2 years ago due to the end of his sentence. None of her relatives knew about it, and there was no one to inform her of the release. During the first year of her imprisonment, Slaga strictly forbade her older children to write to her. She was afraid that such correspondence could affect their reputation in a bad way and hinder their future life. After that, she stopped replying to the letters of her daughters and sons, and later she was transferred several times from one camp to another, from place to place. And when her youngest daughter, Cindy, grew old enough to have the right to search for her mother, it was impossible to find her. Cindy sent inquiries to various authorities for several years, but it seems that the bureaucrats and the penal system themselves were confused by the paperwork and were unable to give the young woman a clear answer. "I did not know my children's 3 new addresses, and my own old home address, during the time in captivity, have forgotten." She only remembered the name of the village where she had once lived with her husband. That's where she decided to go. The camp authorities issued a certificate of release and some road from the colony to the village, past which the railroad passed. The woman hitched a ride. It was not far to go, about 20 kilometers away. At the station, she spent a long time finding out from the cashier how to get to the village, or rather to the center of the region in which the village was located. She and the cashier figured out the route. But here's the trouble. There were no tickets for passing trains. They said to wait. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe next week. She had nothing to do, so she decided to walk around the village near the station. The village was small, not very well maintained. There were no sights or amenities, but the woman didn't care. She was delighted by the very possibility of walking anywhere, without having to answer to anyone and without fear of breaking any rules. She wandered through the streets and alleys, looking at houses and yards, rubbing the backs of stray dogs. Sit down to rest on benches by the fences. It was September. Trees in golden foliage looked incredibly beautiful. The weather was warm and the air was fresh. Clara lost track of time, and when she found herself on the outskirts of the village, she was surprised to notice that it was beginning to get dark. The old woman moved back towards the station, hoping to spend the night at the tiny station. But at that moment, someone hit her hard on the back of the head. Clara fell to the ground and lost consciousness. She woke up in complete darkness and found herself lying in the storm. I tried to get up, but the back of my head hurt treacherously. My head was spinning. My throat was receding, nausea sticking from the fence. The woman sank back down into the thicket, examined herself under the giving grasses, arms, legs intact. Her head was not pierced. No blood, but thickets all around. The knot of Kaz is not rich yet. Not there either. I'm angry. What kind of robber went for old rags and a loaf of bread? Nearly took his life. Who do you think you're robbing? You can tell from a mile away that she's an ex-convict. They see them regularly in the village. They've learned to recognize them by now. But then Clara noticed that she wasn't wearing a trench coat and groped her body and clothes. The woman realized not only her poor belongings were stolen, the certificate of release and the little money she had were gone too. And that was a problem. She couldn't leave without her papers. The only way to legally buy a ticket from here was to show her ID. She couldn't get a passport either. And she was supposed to register with the police within a certain period of time, get a residence permit, and settle some bureaucratic formalities. If she doesn't do that, she'll go back to jail. Shit, I don't want to do that. Even the loss of money didn't bother him as much as the loss of the certificate. But what to do? Where to go? With a complaint of robbery, the woman could not understand. In fact, she couldn't even run. When she tried to stand upright, she began to feel dizzy. Consciousness threatened to leave her long-suffering head. Little by little, her eyes became accustomed to the darkness, and Clara could see a small barn nearby behind a low fence. The woman crawled toward it, climbing over the fence, which, fortunately, was no higher than her knee, climbed inside and entrenched herself in Navalny in the construction of the hayloft. I'll give it up for a while, she thought, and then I'll decide how to be, not to lie under the fence. With this thought, Revu fell asleep. She was awakened by the owner of the barn, who noticed the intrusion into his territory. He was a sturdy old man. He swore at first, but not in a mean way. "What are you doing with that fence?" "My flower has fallen." He got angry. "You could have knocked on the house, asked to spend the night like a human being. Wouldn't he have let you in? We are all human beings. We all treat your brother with understanding." However, having heard about the alarm about what had happened, the muzhik stopped grumbling. He brought his suddenly and guests water and a crust of bread, and himself disappeared, to return soon with a policeman and a local paramedic. The police representative questioned Riva in detail about what had happened to her during the night. He examined the territory, asked for written explanations from the old woman and from the owner of the plot. The paramedic examined the old woman and diagnosed her with a concussion. At least a couple weeks of bed rest was recommended. The man, who introduced himself as Stephen, carried her into the house, arranged her on a shell bed in the kitchen, told her to rest and gain strength. "Anyway, until your documents are resolved, you will not be able to go anywhere," he explained. Stephen said that Clara was not the first in their village to be attacked. For a year now, there have been some kind of seagulls in the neighborhood, hunting for ex-convicts. To recognize them among the locals was simple criminals Bodaroatel, or people who came out of the camp and poked them intimidated, and sometimes just attacked from the back and publicized, as it happened with Lika, and then robbed afterward. Why? The old woman was perplexed. What good would they do to us? There's nothing to take from us. No property, not even pennies on the road. "Oh, you silly Clara," Stephen lamented. "And the documents are a certificate of release. That's their main prey. And that's what they're after. And what do they do with certificates? Do they get free train tickets?" I continued to wonder. "Do they need those tickets?" Waved Stephen away. "You understand that the most important thing in the certificate is that you can get a real passport with it. No check will not dig up. And with this passport you can do so much with it, or sell it for good money. And these crooks know exactly who needs such a document. They correct the certificates in Ashen as they need them. They change the year of birth, change the photo, glue it to these papers at the passport office. They look very closely, especially if the passport office is far from the camp. So they go far away. And then they use the stolen documents to get passports. That's what our district officer told me," he explained. "These bastards have been hanging around here for a long time. But they can't catch them. They're running all over the neighborhood. And with their traveling, it's all over the country." The effects of the concussion took a long time to wear off. Her weakness became her constant companion. She stayed at Stephen's for over a month. During this time, in the local militia, you gave the woman a new certificate, and she received a passport here in the village. You had to go to the permanent place of residence to get the documents. There was no time to go there. The legal deadline was coming to an end. Stephen persuaded the old woman to winter at his place. The man lived alone. His parents had died long ago. He had no wife and children. His brothers and sisters were partly scattered across the country and partly taken away by the war. He was glad to be alive. He was glad to have a soul in the house. He reasoned that it was worth to gain strength and recover before a long trip. Besides, the winter promised cold, and there were no warm clothes. Until the end of May, she lived in the house of her savior, kept house, cooked food. She worked part-time as a cleaner in the village Novi Club, in order to save at least a little money for the road to her native village. When summer came, she got ready to go. She felt better, noticeably stronger. She felt less dizzy. And what about the occasional memory lapse? She tried to ignore that. She said goodbye warmly to Stephen. The man had packed her a substantial bag of provisions for the journey and wanted to give her some money, but she decided that her own savings would suffice. The journey was supposed to take a couple of weeks, but somehow it took almost a year and a half. How come? Leek didn't finish listening. Fell asleep exhausted by the events of the evening. Already later she mentioned that at some point she forgot where she was going. And when she came to her senses, she found herself at an unfamiliar station with no provisions and almost no money. She traveled part of the way on foot. Sometimes she caught a hitchhiker, rode as a hare between the train cars, asked for alms, asked for lodging in villages, slept at the stations, on benches, wherever she had to. And when after all the ordeals she finally reached Putilov and saw her native house in ruins, she almost lost her mind. It became clear that the long journey had been made in vain. There were no relatives. There was nowhere to bow one's head. Of course, one could walk through the village, look for people who remembered her, stay with them. But the old woman was afraid. She still didn't know which of the villagers had written that unfortunate anonymous letter about her and Larkins. But just in case, she trusted no one else. From fatigue and confusion, the old woman fell into a kind of mental trance. In this state, she sat on the cook fence of her former home for over an hour. She would surely have frozen there if Miranda hadn't noticed her. Destiny. The adults alone spoke with significance. It's all mysterious. Others echoed them. I thought nothing was fate. There was no mysticism and mystery in her meeting with her grandmother. It's just that for so many years she'd been calling her home. With her constant stories, with her presence in her house. Grandma just couldn't help but hear. So it's all right. The Kendalls had set up Slaga in a passageway room. The rest of the rooms in the house were occupied. Daughter and son-in-law fixed up the old lady. Did the department grant her a pension? By spring, Clara recovered from her long journey and joined the life of the family. Cindy Larkins clearly thanked all the gods in the world every day for bringing her mother back. Miranda adored her grandmother, even though she was not a sugary character. The old lady was her own free-spirited, risk-taking self, but her relatives forgave her for it. Everyone realized that if she had been God's dandelion, she simply would not have survived either in the camp or after it. Cindy wrote to her sisters and brothers about her mother's return, and all summer long the Kendall family had a pilgrimage of guests of joyful guests. Was that summer happy, filled with the brightest emotions? But with the onset of fall, a serious problem arose in the house. She began to scream in her sleep, talking loudly with interlocutors unknown to anyone. "Give me my bread, or all the assholes are pulling," she shrieked in the middle of the night. "The certificate. My certificate. Where is it? They'll put me back in camp without it. I don't want to." The scream woke up the family. The next night, everything hurts inside. The old woman read in the night, without thinking, "The eye of the bishop. Why such a punishment? It's like I'm being torn to pieces," she called at the top of her voice. "Fooled him. Where are you dragging him? You bastards." These cries woke up the whole house. At first, they were repeated about once a week. But by midwinter, Clara was getting the whole family out of bed every day. She herself remembered nothing of the bad dreams or her screams, but would only shut up when her daughter or grandchildren pulled her out of her sleep. The old woman was embarrassed by the trouble she caused her loved ones, but she couldn't help herself. Sleeping pills and sedatives that the village paramedic offered did not help. After them, on the contrary, it became more difficult to wake up the old woman during her nightmares. She should be treated in a psychoneurological dispensary, thoughtfully said the local medic Cindy. At these words exploded. "Do you want me to send my own mother to a mental institution?" That's the last thing we need. But nevertheless, Kendall's life was becoming increasingly difficult. The family stopped getting enough sleep. Grandma's seizures could recur several times a night, and there was no rest in between. Christopher and Cindy became irritable. They often complained of fatigue. No wonder, because after restless nights they had to go to work. Yes, it's not easy shifting papers in a warm office. And doing physical labor. Miranda and her older brother also felt the impact of not having enough to eat, although it was a little easier for them as children than for adults. It went on like this until the spring. By May, Cindy Larkins was ready, if not to accept the paramedic's suggestion that the old woman be treated in a mental hospital, then at least to discuss it further. She and her husband were completely exhausted and didn't know what to do. Miranda, hearing the conversation of the elders, realized that the grandmother would not approve of the treatment. Moreover, she would be angry at her daughter for such a decision. And then Miranda would be angry with her. The girl suggested to her mother to move the old woman to her room. She lived in the farthest corner of the house from her parents' bedroom and hoped that from there she would not hear her scream so much. "She'll give you no peace at all," Cindy Larkins lamented. "So what?" Miranda waved it off. "It's summer. I don't have to get up for school during the day. At least you and Daddy will have a rest." Was the girl so convincing, Mother? Too exhausted. But soon the old woman's relocation took place. The first few nights the girl swore, jumping out of bed, hearing another scream. However, after a few days she thought that it was possible to try to cope with the grandmother after a nightmare sleep and forced booth. The old lady fell asleep for a long time. Noise contrived, complaining about the fact that it disturbs her granddaughter. It's exhausting even more than her shouting. And Miranda decided to come up with a way to soothe her without waking her from sleep. At first, the girl simply approached her grandmother, barely hearing her voice, stroked her head, and on her hands quietly and affectionately coaxed her. "It's a dream, Grandma," she repeated patiently. "It's not real. It's all right. You are at home. No one is hurting you. Mommy and Daddy are there for you. They'll protect you." But the old woman just didn't hear her granddaughter. And then Miranda devised another plan. The next night in the next bed, there were cries. "That's my bread, give it back, to whom I say, you shameful thief." Miranda sneaked up on her grandmother and spoke persuasively. "Here's your bread, girl. Nobody's taking it away from you. I took it to salt you with salt, it tastes better. Here." The girl repeated it several times, and suddenly Clara heard her. "It tastes better with salt," she agreed. "Thank you. Forgive me, I was scared." The old woman turned sideways and fell asleep peacefully. Miranda froze enthusiastically at her bedside. Had it really worked? The rest of the night passed surprisingly quietly. In the morning, the lyricist rose awake before noon. She wanted to tell her grandmother about the night's events, but with some sixth sense she realized that it was not worth it. Instead, she asked her grandmother, "You sometimes yell about bread at night. Did someone really take it away from you?" "True," the old woman replied reluctantly. "I had just been brought to the first camp in Barak, and there was a woman who tried to take my rations. I attacked her. Where did the anger come from? I don't know." My grandmother was silent, and then she added, "But you know, I remember now that she gave me back my piece. She said she wanted to salt it." Miranda nodded her head. She didn't know how the story of the stolen harmonica really ended, but she suspected that the outcome was not as peaceful as her grandmother saw it today. She remembered the phrase about salt from a dream in which her granddaughter had intervened. The girl decided to continue her experiments, but not only to appease her grandmother, but also out of research interest. The next night, barely beyond the dream, she began to wail pitifully. "Everything hurts, like it's tearing me to pieces from the inside." Miranda immediately crept over to her bedside and spoke closer. "Get some rest. Here is the most modern medicine for you. You take it. Everything will go away. Everything will stop hurting. Good for you." As if letting go, muttered the grandmother a moment after the girl's words. "Of course," confirmed Miranda. "The pain will go away now." "You sleep. You'll wake up and forget everything." Soon the old woman stopped moaning. She sang and even curled up under the blanket. Miranda realized that the nightmare had receded. Once again, the grandmother slept peacefully until morning. But the next day, her granddaughter did not ask her about the nightmare. Determined not to awaken her memories, Miranda took the experiment seriously. She kept a notebook in which she noted how often she talked to Clara in her sleep, how quickly she calmed down, whether the attack was repeated, and soon noticed from her notes that the nightmares in which she managed to wedge in repeated less and less often, and after a few months and disappeared altogether. This encouraged the young explorer even more. In her for a flicker of hope that it will be possible to completely cure her grandmother of night attacks. And soon this hope was confirmed. Nightmares began to visit her less and less often. Sometimes Miranda slept through the night without her screams. Sometimes you only had to get up to her once a night. But there was no more like the beginning of last fall, when Slaga read every 2 o'clock. Miranda considered it her small victory. Not always the girl managed to calm the old woman with the first time to pick up the words. For example, when Clara started calling for her husband and screaming to let him go, she usually had to be woken up. "Miranda, I tried telling her your husband wasn't taking him anywhere." But the old woman didn't believe it. She'd spent too many years without her husband. She remembered the separation too well. The phrase, "We'll figure it all out and bring your husband back." No one of Slava's age would have believed such a statement from the law enforcement officers. Miranda went through the phrases. I wrote down the unsuccessful ones. Finally, she guessed to address her grandmother as if on behalf of her grandfather and promise her that he would surely survive, and they would meet again. Soon after this discovery, Clara's most agonizing nightmare gradually let her go. Before the start of the school year, Cindy Larkin suggested that her daughter move her grandmother from her bedroom back into the pass-through room, but Miranda refused. She reported to her mother that Clara had become a much more restful sleeper. Cindy had noted this herself, although her daughter's room was away from the bedroom. At first, she often heard the usual night noises from there, but by the end of the summer, such episodes became fewer and fewer. After rejection, she was glad several times to the door of her room at night, hearing her mother's voice and eavesdropping on what was going on. Finding out what was going on, Cindy Larkins pondered the situation and went to hold a consultation with the local paramedic. He approved of Miranda's methodology. The doctor talked to the girl, read her diary of observations of her grandmother, asked about the results, and afterwards he praised Miranda fervently, saying that if she continued her experiment, she would be able to cure her grandmother completely. He explained for a long time how and why the method invented by Miranda works. He said some wise words the girl did not understand even half of it. But she did. She's on the right track. A year later, a peaceful sleep returned to Kendall's house. She stopped screaming at night. And if she had a nightmare, the family knew how to calm her down quickly. They didn't tell the grandmother herself. They just tried to treat her as kindly as possible. Miranda could be proud of herself, but she had no time for that. She judged the paramedic for a while to explain to her how things had turned out in simple words. To the medic's credit, he did not dismiss the curious girl and managed to lay out his assumptions for her. In addition, he recommended several popular scientific publications from which you can understand how the human psyche works. The subject fascinated Miranda, and she plunged headlong into the study of psychology. First on the basics, and then more seriously. By the end of school, the girl already knew exactly what she wanted to devote her life to and did not retreat from her decision. All this long story Miranda told the parents of her future son-in-law. Of course, it was much shorter. Although David constantly intervened in the narration, clarified the details, drew the listener's attention to the details. He himself had heard this story not for the first time and liked it very much. He admired the ingenuity of little Miranda, the selflessness with which she took to help her grandmother, the patience and warmth of heart she showed during her impromptu healing session. I would never have thought of this at 11 years old, the young man exclaimed. Among other things, David was struck by the very history of the Kendall family. born in the mid-90s. He had not seen the Soviet Union and about repressions, camps, persecutions on ethnic grounds. He knew the KGB and NKVD only through excerpts from old movies and history books. It was strange for the young boy to encounter people who had actually seen and experienced all this. He was especially surprised that these people were not stale old men, but quite cheerful and adequate people. His future father-in-law and mother-in-law, Kelly and John. Miranda's story impressed him too. After it, they had a long conversation about the vicissitudes of fate, about how childhood events influenced the choice of profession, about the Soviet era, about human kindness. The discussion of the wedding was not just on the second, but on the 10th plan. But the conversation turned out to be sincere and heartfelt. And by feelings, Jenkins brought the future relatives closer, despite their difference in age, education, and social status. After all, that was the purpose of the joint dinner. So at least, reasoned Miranda, parted at 0 o'clock for the city elders left by cab. David stayed at the bride's apartment. They are sunny, sent the parents to bed, and themselves cleaned the table, went through the dishes, tidied up the living room and kitchen. The guy thought that he was obliged to help the future relatives, at least in this, since he was not allowed to help in the organization of the dinner, which was held for him, and therefore he did not know that, returning home, his mother said to her husband, "How do you like that? John, we're going to have a hereditary Jewess in our family, and from a family with a criminal record." I was hoping David would find a better match. "Okay," John responded to you. He didn't pick anything. He's in love with this thread and her family wholeheartedly. Do you care if she's Jewish or Turkish with a criminal record or a spotless one? They have plenty of money. Pensions for doctors of sciences, a decent apartment. You've seen for yourself what a great party they are in material terms. And you and I don't need anything else. We decided to get married in 6 months in September. I didn't want beautiful fall photos under the dress. David was not against it, and parents amicably decided not to hinder the newlyweds and not to impose their ideas about the celebration. While the bride and groom were saving money for the party, outfits, treats, and a bachelorette party, it was decided long ago that after the wedding, the young people will live at Jenkins and save money for the down payment on the mortgage. And they should have thought about their careers. Both boys had little seniority, couldn't afford to borrow much money from the bank, and the salaries were not such that painlessly pay off the loan for housing. Miranda and Sebastian were completely satisfied with this solution. They found it reasonable in their large apartment with 3 isolated rooms. There was enough space for both parents and the young family. But the out-of-towners didn't like the idea for some reason. But openly, they did not express their protests. John, in mail conversations with Sebastian, he periodically complained that the son does not act according to the rules. They said that a man should bring his wife to his house and not move to her. Jenkins on these speeches only guffawed. It's all prejudice and long out of date. John came in, on the other hand. But a young family, come to think of it, they want to make some noise sometimes. But during this very time, and there are parents behind the wall, you have to admit, it's embarrassing. Imagine yourself in such a situation and will never have grandchildren. You've been here, John. Sebastian wondered. From the thread and the room to our half of the apartment. How noisy do you have to be for us to hear, unless you yell into a microphone? Would the guests want to invite us to a party? I guess, John. People need a place to gather with their friends. Or they'll just sit up late watching TV, and you'll be noisy at 0 o'clock. We're fine, smiled Jenkins. Yeah, agreed, was John. I remember Miranda wasn't used to being kept up at night by the noise from the in-laws. Sebastian gave his companion a serious look, raised an eyebrow questioningly. I mean that she could endure the inconvenience for a long time for the sake of the people closest to her and not say anything to them about it. Tactfully, I'm a woman, John quickly mouthed and curtailed the subject. There was no need to quarrel with the future in-laws yet. Kelly was more subtle. Over a cup of tea, she could complain to Miranda. David, The other day, my boy was frying cutlets. I come in. Oh my goodness. The whole kitchen's smoky. The stove's got grease on the coffee. Splashes on the table, flour scattered. And he sits in front of a mountain of cutlets and says I'm treating my mom. And he doesn't notice what he's turned the kitchen into. You have to be such a Bezrukov. Grown-ups are already on the torture. You're with him, Miranda. Not scared. He was joking. Kelly, you haven't seen what goes on in our kitchen. After Sebastian's fish fry. The man is incorrigible. Kelly nodded, but by the next meeting, she'd start all over again, all over me. Would you be comfortable living with Slovaks? After all, a stranger in the house, and besides, a young man just so from the morning from the bedroom in a nightgown will not jump out of the bedroom. I have never been in the habit of jumping out of the bedroom unclothed, Miranda objected softly. David is no stranger to us. He's stayed overnight, or on weekends more than once. We've never been inconvenienced. Don't worry, Kelly. No worries at all. It's one thing to have him as a guest, and quite another to have him as a permanent resident. And that you're getting tired of this topic being mooted. You guys can't have a life. You yourself understand it perfectly well. And to rent an apartment, it is not rational at their incomes that the newlyweds settled for the city could not be out of the question. Everyone understood that. The David family lived in a two-room adjoining Khrushchevka, where the guy owned a passageway room. When he was a teenager, he tried to persuade his father to make repairs and isolate his room. But John quickly explained to his son the unreality of this idea. Expensive, messy, troublesome. The room would be cramped. The apartment will be blocked by a dark, long corridor, which is not used rationally. In addition, because of this, redevelopment will reduce the living area of their Khrushchevka, which will lead to a drop in its value. In short, unprofitable from all sides. David then reconciled, blocked off part of the room with a closet, thus allocating himself a personal space, and about the repair shut up. Later, getting acquainted with Robert, he sometimes regretted that he did not show insistence to bring the girl in a separate room. Although tiny, it still goes anywhere, but in the country behind the closet is simply impossible. The current hints of David's parents only annoyed, especially since for the city expressed their thoughts not only Jenkins Sr., but also Netta. For example, one day Kelly took the future daughter-in-law to the cat show, and their threads looked at one of the kittens, a red and fluffy Maine Coon. The girl more than half an hour stood near his cage, admiring and pleasing. So let's buy him, Kelly suggested. I'll add to you if you don't have enough. You can't, sighed Lisa. Dad's allergic to cats. Then get the breeder's contacts and buy one after the wedding, Kelly suggested. And then, as if she'd come to her senses, she added, "Oh, you'll be living with your parents anyway. If only you had your own apartment." Slowly, Kelly and John put their future daughters-in-law into the family's heads. The idea that the young ones needed their own place. Eventually, Miranda got fed up with it. She summoned the town's spouses for a talk, and she called David and Robert and her husband. "Kelly, John," she began, "we've all noticed that you don't like the prospect of David living in our apartment after the wedding. Let's discuss this situation once and for all. First, let's admit to each other that we have no alternatives. The young people will not be able to live with you. This will inevitably lead to domestic conflicts. We are not in a position to buy an apartment. We don't have that kind of money. We do not intend to exchange our existing housing. You, as far as I understand, you also do not have the financial means to evict David. Otherwise, you would have done it a long time ago." John shook his head. "No," he admitted, "except for a down payment. We could scrape together a studio of some kind." "Not a studio," Lisa resented. "If you're going to mess with the mortgage, then buy a full-fledged apartment, albeit one room these to fly. Where is the room combined with the kitchen? Well, we'd probably add something to your money for a down payment, but we don't have a lot of money. I warn you, we'll get a one-room Khrushchevka somewhere in the suburbs. And the guys are still more comfortable living in the center. It's not far to work, and there's all the infrastructure. They can't rent an apartment and save for a mortgage at the same time. So, I believe, moving in with us, David, is the only sensible decision, especially since the children made it themselves. We expect it won't be for long. David cut in. 5 years at the most. But that's me calculating the worst-case scenarios. Moreover, said Sebastian, we will help by providing housing and not requiring the kids to contribute to the household expenses, so as not to slow down the rate of savings. But I would object to the expenses, said David. I don't like to be a freeloader, and we will discuss it. If necessary, Miranda responded immediately. That's what the situation looks like so far. Maybe you see some other ways to solve it that the four of us don't see. She turned to Kelly with John, for the townspeople looked at each other, shrugged confusedly. Not yet, it seemed, Kelly said. In that case, let's consider it a done deal, Jenkins summarized. And please don't start any more conversations about how inconvenient it is for anyone or how wrong it is in general. It's tedious and uncomfortable, Smith's words added, and almost with glee. Kelly and John had to agree before the wedding. They kept their heads down and didn't broach the subject of bridal real estate again. All the more did not remember the idea to organize on the day of their marriage. For Kelly and John, the future mother-in-law was only in favor, but he himself categorically did not want a second ceremony. Realizing that the man cannot change his mind, Lisa said, well, and the hell with it, come up with something more interesting. And came up with as a bachelorette party arranged all the close women, including Miranda and Kelly, masked photo shoot in wedding dresses. For this event, she invited several makeup artists and hairdressers, conspired with a rental salon to provide outfits and space, and with a nearby restaurant. About a small buffet. The ladies were a little shy at first, but the champagne abundance of outfits around did their job. Soon, everyone invited. With pleasure and excitement, tried on dresses, posed for photographers, tested unusual makeup. The party turned out very girlish and yet romantic. No, she was pleased. And Kelly later told her in confidence that even re-registration with her husband would not have given her so much joy and pleasure. In short, there was no time to discuss where the new family would live. However, John had prepared a surprise for the wedding dinner. The dinner was modest. Only the young people and their parents celebrated the marriage. With friends, David and Robert decided the next day, and immediately after the registry office and photo shoot went with their relatives to a cozy restaurant, David, in the city of excellent cuisine and service of extra class. When the turn came to handing out gifts, the new father-in-law solemnly rose from his seat and said, guys, I decided as a gift to buy you an apartment. Here are the documents. He held out to the newlyweds a thin folder. I thought, he continued, that my savings are enough either for a ready-made studio or a 2-bedroom. But for the construction phase, I mean the down payment. Of course, I wouldn't be able to afford the whole thing. But so far my earnings are stable, and one good contract should be coming up soon. So I got in touch with a real estate developer. And now we have a 2-room apartment near the center. True, the house is still at the foundation stage, but the builder is reliable. I checked. It's scheduled for completion in 2 years. They're giving it to you with renovation. Just move in and live. Once it's built, now we'll register the house with you. In the meantime, the loan is on me, and I'll pay. It's a gift after all. The news made a lot of noise around the table. Robert and her husband and parents went to see the house under construction a couple of days later. The new building was indeed very well located in the so-called quiet center. The neighborhood was green and cozy. Not far from the house were stores of basic necessities. Kindergarten, school. There was a prospective apartment in the next block. Sebastian grinned, and with grandchildren will be comfortable to live. And the manager who accompanied them would also confirm. We have in the project provides wheelchairs on the first floor, ramps at each porch, and a great playground in a closed courtyard. And the whole territory is under video surveillance. You can even let one child go for a walk and not worry about his safety. Jenkins' senior impression, and nodded approvingly. She didn't let this information pass her ears. She looked at the floor plans with curiosity, looked for her future apartment on the floor plan. And when she found it, it seems that she immediately began to arrange the furniture there in her imagination. A representative of the developer took the families to a neighboring building, recently commissioned by his company. Some of the apartments in it were still empty, and it was possible to get inside and look at the renovation by the builders, and generally assess the quality of housing. After this trip, even David, who had previously been skeptical about his father's gift, felt grateful to John and began to dream of moving. "Great," Sebastian exclaimed on the way home. "Here he was being a friend to you, and here's a royal gift for you guys. But for now, he's not splurging too much." "It's cool," Miranda noticed. "At the foundation stage, these apartments are cheap enough. Not a penny, of course. But for our 3-bedroom, we can get 3 2-bedrooms like this. He'll splurge later when he starts paying off the loan." I suggested to my father that we pay off the loan. David responded immediately, but he refused. He said it was his gift. It was the best we could do. "What is this? Us taking over the mortgage after we move in? When the apartment's built, when it's finished, my dad'll transfer it to us. We'll live and pay for it then. Until then, he's on his own." "Is it a big payment?" asked Sebastian, and hearing the amount, whistled delightedly. "Almost my entire pension," shocked the matchmaker. "He says that as long as his income allows," David explained. "Yes, he is also counting on some contract with Europe, which will supposedly provide him and my mom with income for eternity. I don't know much about his business affairs," finished the young man, a little embarrassed. "You don't need it. You have your own work to do," Miranda reassured her son-in-law. "But God willing, it will all work out. Basically, nothing has changed yet," Lisa said thoughtfully. "We are still living with you and still saving money. Only now it's not for the mortgage, but for renovation and furniture. Let's see how this developer shows himself. Although it will be a pity, of course, if something is delayed." That was that. David settled down in Robert's room, moved his things and computer, and set up his own workspace. He really got along with his wife's parents without any problems. Of course, there were some little things in terms of everyday life, which had to get used to anew. But it was perceived and mighty with his father-in-law as an inevitable stage of lapping, and did not cause violent emotions. In general, the two families coexisted in one apartment quite peacefully. On weekdays, they did not see each other very often. The young ones worked late, and after work they usually went to some events like concerts in bars, theater performances, or just visiting friends. The older generation had their own thing going on. Sebastian continued to work part-time at his institute, and on weekends he went fishing, including in winter. Julia counseled privately and worked with students, helping them write academic papers and conducting research. Officially, the Jenkins seniors were retired, but they could not imagine life without work. Once a month, the families would stop by the construction site and were pleased to see that the house where their apartment would be located was coming up. The construction was strictly on schedule, and in some aspects even ahead of schedule. And David and Robert gradually got used to the idea that they would live here. Little by little, they got acquainted with the neighborhood, planned the situation in the future housing. Even Robert's parents had already accepted the idea and were discussing their children's plans with no less enthusiasm than they were. Nothing foreshadowed trouble. Moreover, John made regular installments on the loan to the builder. Thus passed about half a year. Towards spring, the Jenkins noticed that John had become nervous and anxious. Sebastian called him for a conversation and learned that the conclusion of the contract with European partners, on which the man had pinned so much hope, for some reason stalled. "We'll have to tighten our belts, it seems," sighed the matchmaker. "With the current customer, we have a contract ends in May. Will he renew it or not? We don't know yet, and it's not a very convenient customer. In general, he will get discounts from us when renewing. How's that sound? And where will I get them from?" We're already working with him at almost cost price. I also bought some equipment specifically for the Europeans. The money is spent, and the equipment is idle. They didn't know what John Jenkins was doing. Even David couldn't explain to them the specifics of his father's company, some kind of small production. But what kind of manufacturing? What does it produce and who does it sell to? No one knew. John himself, starting to talk about the work, began to rush with obscure terms, from which the interlocutors quickly tired. So his explanations did not add clarity. But Sebastian understood the holy financial crisis. "John, with the mortgage you pull so far or help?" he asked. "Pulled until God willing," the man responded. However, a couple months later, John came to Jenkins and said to Sebastian, "Listen, Saint, help. I can't take any more credit. I scraped together the last pennies for the last payment, and I don't know where to get money for the next one. I work alone. You know, Kelly, we're all looking out for ourselves. She's no help at all." "What are you talking about, John?" Sebastian exclaimed. "I'll help, of course. We're not strangers. And the apartment is being built not only for your son, but also for my daughter. Tell me where to transfer and by what date. I'll do it." "Thanks, my brother-in-law helped me out. By next month I'll have it up and running," John promised. "Oh, and don't tell the kids, please. It's embarrassing. He said it was a small gift for the wedding, and now he's left with nothing." "I won't tell," Sebastian reassured his relative. "I'm not going to tell you, I guess. I have a stash that my wife doesn't know about, just for such occasions, so don't worry. We'll save your reputation." John thanked Jenkins profusely. He promised it was just a one-time thing. By the next installment, everything would be fine. But it turned out that Sebastian paid for the apartment under construction for the next year. John returned his money to him only twice, and then, not completely discouraged, and with the crisis in his company, David and Robert said nothing. The guys continued to travel regularly to the construction site and plan the move. The building where their future apartment was located was already erected, and they were excitedly measuring the floor among the still bare concrete walls and deciding where to put the sofa, where to place the table, and in which corner a floor lamp would look better. Jenkins didn't want to deprive them of this joy, but Miranda had to confess her collusion with the saint. There is no wife who doesn't know about her spouse's stash, even if it's kept in a bank account and managed solely from a private office. Miranda noticed that her husband began to look more often than usual into the internet bank, which he had not used before, that by a certain day of the month he began to check the status of his cards, to transfer something somewhere. She didn't bother with suspicions. She just asked directly. Sebastian, who was not used to having secrets from his wife, gave in at once. Jenkins listened to the story, thought a little, and said thoughtfully, "God forbid that everything should be all right," and ended with an incomprehensible phrase for her husband: "Good that you transfer the money from your account, not cash." However, Sebastian did not pay attention to this remark. A few more months passed before John showed up at Jenkins with a penitent look. He arrived on a weekend when the entire population of the apartment and the younger and older ones were home. Gathering everyone in the kitchen, he began to get upset. "Came to apologize, comrades. The contract I had so hoped for is obviously no more. With old clients, my contracts are over. All in all, my firm is almost bankrupt. I've decided to sell it for a blood loss. I'm sorry, guys, I know I promised you, but I'm not holding out." "How do you mean sell it?" David was surprised. "What do you mean?" "Directly," John said sadly. "I'll put it up for sale under an assignment agreement, so sell it to us. Lisa found it right away. We will continue to pay off the loan." "And what will I use to pay off my work debts?" John sighed. "I can't charge you for the apartment. I'll take it from an outside buyer, especially since I already have one in mind. But I'm sorry, guys, I know you were hoping. But I promise you, as soon as things get better, I'll buy you a better apartment than this one." Robert and David and Sebastian. There was a lot of noise for a while. suggesting options. Miranda was silent, scrutinizing the matchmaker. Sebastian came out to escort John to the entrance and asked in a low voice, "Hey, matchmaker, and my money, which I gave for the loan, will you give back from the sale?" We'll decide, said the city quickly. "I'm in a hurry. I'm running." A longing settled in the Jenkins apartment. The young people were upset and discouraged. They were too used to thinking of this new building as their own. They had too many plans for it. Sebastian was worried about the money he'd spent for nothing. John, after apologizing, hadn't visited in over a month, and he was unavailable by phone. Kelly made long conversations, but did not report on her husband's affairs, claiming that she knew nothing about them. One evening, after making sure the children were firmly entrenched in their room, Miranda called her husband into the kitchen and handed him some printouts. "What are these?" Sebastian asked, puzzled. "It's data from the Rosary Store website," she explained. "John, our faraway sold. Even before he repented to us, he came the day before. He didn't mention the debts. He didn't say anything to you. When I asked him, he said we'll figure it out. That's all." Sebastian studied the documents, then shook his head in confusion. "He's a fraud, our matchmaker, sadly," Miranda summarized. "Why did you jump right in?" "Sebastian, the man's in a financial crisis. What's in it for him?" He embarrassed himself. He embarrassed himself in front of his kids. He doesn't give a damn about his kids or ours." Miranda was angry. "And Sebastian's benefit is very simple and transparent. He bought this apartment at the foundation stage a year and a half ago. Since then, and the dollar rate has grown, and the situation on the real estate market has changed, and the apartment has gone up. I saw it myself. The house is almost ready. Now this two-bedroom is $6 million more expensive than when he bought it. I checked. Look at this." John took out a loan with no down payment. There was a developer's promotion, and he only made 5 6-month payments. So he didn't spend more than $200,000. And now he sold the apartment, paid off the rest of the loan, and got about $4 million. That's a nice profit. In a year and a half with that kind of investment, it's a good profit, Sebastian agreed. But what makes you think it's fraud? That he thought it all out in advance and acted, as they say, in self-interest. Yes, if only because he hasn't paid you back yet. Even though he has the money from the sale, Miranda replied reasonably. It's been a month, by the way, and he hasn't even shown his face to us. Everyone hides during that time. Apparently, he's not going to give anything back. What was the point of the whole show to promise the kids an apartment? He could have just bought it for himself, waited for it to go up in value and sold it. Sebastian, but you're like a little kid, really. The woman didn't know whether to be angry or upset. Without the show, he'd have to pay the mortgage himself. So most of his mortgage was paid for. You figure you're paying for your daughter's house. Sebastian didn't have time to answer. The door opened and David came into the kitchen. "David, I'm sorry," he said, slightly embarrassed, but more wary. "I overheard part of your conversation. Sebastian, is that right? You paid the mortgage instead of your father." Jenkins nodded. "And he didn't pay you back?" The boy kept asking. Sebastian shook his head. David lowered his eyes. He was quiet for a moment. "We have some savings," he said. Finally, "How much does your father owe you?" "I can pay you back that money. There are savings and well," grumbled Sebastian. "Let it sit. It'll come in handy. A son can't answer for his father, can he?" The man winked mockingly at his son-in-law. "And I'll pay for my mistakes myself. Maybe I'll still be able to persuade John." "Let me talk to him myself," David suggested. "It's easier for me. I don't think he's hiding from me." "Talk if you want to," Miranda nodded. "I don't think so. Are you really going to convince him of anything?" "That money wasn't good for us," Sebastian explained. "I mean, it wasn't the last money we gave him. No offense. It was just a rainy day fund. You know, age. You gotta be prepared for all sorts of illnesses and stuff. But it's a shame. David, you know, I understand, nodded the guy. I'm offended and ashamed, too. I thought you were going to call me out of the house after all this, and Robert. I'll talk to my dad. He finished and stalked out of the kitchen. John really wasn't hiding from his son, but he laughed at his requests to return the money he'd paid Jenkins. What money are you talking about? He was surprised. I didn't borrow from him. I didn't give him any receipts. I didn't promise to pay him back. He offered to help me when he found out about my difficulties. So I took him up on it. So he thought he was paying the rent for me and the thread. The boy objected. But what did he think? Stretched John mockingly. Yes, I promised you that apartment, but I overdid it. I didn't calculate my possibilities, but it was registered to me. So I'm the owner. I bought it when I wanted, sold it when I wanted. What's your beef? So you bought it with someone else's money. David was outraged. And why someone else's? Explain, shook his head father. A relative helped me. A close person. Do you consider him a stranger too? You live in his house, don't you? Aren't you ashamed? So pay back your relative. David tried his best to speak calmly, not reacting to his father's taunts. And you prove that it was a debt. John grinned. There was no debt. It was voluntary contributions. That was nice of the family. There was no debt. At last the men shouted at each other, and their conversation turned into a real quarrel. David achieved nothing for his father-in-law, but firmly promised his father that until Sebastian got his money back, he would not communicate with his father. A great loss. John followed the offspring. That night he called Jenkins and expressed his displeasure. What are you, a matchmaker? You're turning my son against me, he said reproachfully. I thought you were in my position. I agree to wait while I sort out my finances, and you not only started to beat your pennies out of me, but also David against me. I didn't expect that kind of meanness. The conversation was on speakerphone. Sebastian was fiddling with a word at the moment of the call, and his hands were dirty. David, hearing his father's complaints, was lazy. How can you have a conscience? He shouted into the phone. You're a liar and a cheat. We'll sue you in court, you say, snorted John. Son against father. But sue over laughing lawyers. And he disconnected. Uncle Sebastian, I think you should really file a complaint against him, David said, in a passionate voice. He won't give the money back in kind. David, what's the point of all this squabbling? Jenkins said sadly. You and your father are going to get in trouble. Honestly, I don't want anything to do with him. After that, he left David with a thread to play on our nerves. Lied to your eyes. Deprived you of your savings. He thought I might lose my beloved wife after such tricks. What are you doing with Miranda? You won't let me in the door. Like hell you wouldn't. He didn't care. I don't want anything to do with him. After that. Don't get hot, David, don't get hot, Sebastian reassured him. Not sure what else to say, but his son-in-law had already decided to act. The firm where David worked as an engineer had a legal department. He went there, described his situation to the staff, and asked them to recommend a good lawyer who could help his family recover a debt from his ex-family. In principle, I could do it, said one of the trust employees, Charles, thoughtfully. I've dealt with similar situations before, but I'd have to talk to yours first. I could do it today, the guy said cheerfully. Just Charles, if you need anything. You work for my father-in-law for free. As a friendship, so to speak, and we'll settle the fee issue separately, if we win the case or even bring the court costs from the defendant. Don't worry, smiled the lawyer, but I accept the deal. You don't want to worry the old people. So, they are already worried, sighed David. Charles did not spend too long talking to Jenkins. First of all, he clarified for himself how Sebastian had made the payment on David's loan to his father. When he found out that the money was transferred directly to the mortgage account from Sebastian's card, he was happy. That's great, he exclaimed. This is direct evidence that you transferred funds to the defendant. And not just for nothing, but for specific purposes. Receipts of transfers prove that you participated in the purchase of his apartment, so you're entitled to a share of the sale. Print them out for me, please." Sebastian was hesitant to sue his son-in-law's father. It seemed awkward to him, but his wife and David convinced him. And the man that same evening, with the help of Charles, wrote a pre-trial complaint to John. The document was sent by registered mail, but there was no response from the city. Then Sebastian, again with the assistance of a lawyer, wrote a statement of claim. To it, they enclosed copies of documents on the apartment and the extract from Roserister, found in the network Miranda, and receipts for transfers, and a copy of the claim and a receipt for sending it. The lawyer took all these papers to the district court the next day. Additionally, David attached to the package of documents a flash drive with audio recording of his conversation with his father voice recorder in his phone. He then turned it on just in case. Knowing the character of John, he could agree to something, and a date later refused to retract his words. The guy thought the recording would help him avoid that. He didn't even think about a trial at that time. But the audio came in handy. Charles said it would be another argument in Jenkins' favor. The trial took several months and cost the family a lot of heartache. Kelly and John regularly called the Jenkinses and asked them to settle the case amicably. They offered to wait. They threatened, tried to scandalize. But Sebastian and Miranda were adamant, although the elderly woman often had to take sedatives after such calls. They upset her too much. Miranda was too worried that she couldn't see the true nature of her new relatives in time. "Mom, why were you soothing her? Robert, you're not a psychic after all. How could you have known there was so much dirt in them?" "Exactly. David, I've been around them for years, and I didn't expect this kind of meanness. They're my parents." "You don't understand," Jenkins joked. "This is a big professional setback for me. I'm a psychologist with a long experience, with a doctorate. And it's unthinkable to misjudge people like this. Psychologist, you've been exhorting on the job, and outside of work. You're an ordinary woman, and like every human being, you have the right to make a mistake. So give yourself permission to exercise it." Miranda nodded, agreed. But each subsequent call threw her off balance. Not for nothing. Oh, not for nothing. She'd been so worried before her first visit for the city's scarecrow of heart to their home. She thought, but all things must come to an end. So did litigation. The Jenkins won the battle. The court ordered John to pay the full amount Sebastian spent on his loan, plus legal fees. It took some more time to fight with the bailiffs, who were supposed to collect the money and return it to its rightful owners. David was already at war with this service. Sebastian had no time to bother the bailiffs on a daily basis, and his health no longer allowed him to perform such active and energetic actions. So David appointed himself the legal representative of his father-in-law. 3 months passed after the court decision came into legal force. When the money finally arrived in the Jenkins account, the message about the deposit was read to Sebastian at dinner and was greeted with applause by the family. "I checked at the bank office, and everything is indeed in order," the man said. "And I was thinking, since we have such a sum, and you have some savings, should we not get involved in the mortgage again? Only now we're going to do it by the book. Miranda and I will give you a down payment. You'll make more of your own, won't you? You'll be able to buy a 2-bedroom. Not as luxurious as in that new building, but quite decent. After all, a young family should live in their own home. Is that what you wanted?" To be honest, Sebastian hesitantly began. "David, we didn't really want to sit around. It was Aunt Kelly who gave me a headache, a vacation, and I'm so into this new apartment. But I actually like it better at home. I'm used to it. And so is David. Not if we're disturbing you." "What are you? Lisa?" Miranda exclaimed. "You're not disturbing us at all, but it's for your convenience." The young couple looked at each other, and there was a certain cunning in their glances. "But if it's for our convenience," said Lisa in a slightly strained voice, "then hold on. For our convenience, it would be better not to move out, but to live together with you, because David and I are going to have a child soon, and we are counting on your help with him." She looked at the changed face of her parents and added in the tone of a mom, "Well, please, I'm afraid that I won't be able to cope with the baby alone." "What's the conversation about?" Lisa Sebastian was glowing with happiness. "We'll help you with your grandson. Don't worry. The mother will refuse. I'm still good for something." "Why would I refuse?" Miranda smiled. "I'm very much in favor. I'm not used to staying awake at night at the bedside of my loved ones. Just Lisa, for God's sake. Don't send the father to register the baby, and don't send David either. Just in case. Believe me, in my experience, it's a matter for the mother to handle on her own."